They say the multiverse smells like something, if you know how to notice it. A texture underneath reality, faint and mineral, like ozone before a storm that never quite arrives. Whis had been chasing that scent for the better part of an afternoon, though afternoon meant very little when you were drifting between the folds of existence with a staff in one hand and a mild craving for something sweet in the other. He was not lost. Whis was never lost. He was, at most, exploring in a direction that had not yet proven useful. Beside him, seated cross-legged on nothing at all, floating in the calm nowhere space between dimensions, Beerus was doing what he did best, being extremely displeased. "You said 20 minutes, the god of destruction said, not opening his eyes. "It has been considerably longer than 20 minutes. Has it?" Whis said, in the tone of a man mildly delighted by his own unreliability. "Time is such a funny thing to keep track of out here. It bends, it folds. Sometimes it just wanders off. I don't care what time is doing. I care that you told me there was a planet 3 folds from here, with a pudding culture that would, and I quote, restore my faith in lesser civilizations." Beerus's tail lashed once, sharp as a whip crack. "I have eaten nothing in 4 hours, Whis. 4 hours. "We're very close now," Whis said, in the exact tone he used for things that were not, in fact, close. He tilted his staff, and the orb atop it pulsed faintly, parting the fabric between one reality and the next, like a curtain drawn back by a patient hand. Just one more little adjustment. The rift that opened beneath them was not large. It did not need to be. A pinprick was enough, when the thing on the other side of it was an entire universe, and Wiss's little adjustment folded the space between them and it down to something you could step through without noticing you'd left home. Which was, more or less, exactly what happened. Beerus felt the ground under him change before he understood why. The particular gravity of a new world settling into his bones, the pressure of a sky he'd never stood under before, and opened his eyes to find himself no longer floating in the calm nothing between realities, but standing on a rooftop, in the wind, above a city he had never once heard of in his 11 billion years of existence. Below him, Musutafu sprawled out in the blue hour before evening, glass towers catching the last orange light, 100,000 small lives moving through streets that had no idea, not the faintest idea, what had just arrived above them. Whis. Beerus's voice was very quiet, which was, for those who knew him, considerably more alarming than if he had shouted. "Where is my pudding planet?" Whis straightened beside him, hands folded neatly behind his back, and turned in a slow circle, taking in the skyline with an expression of open, unguarded delight, the look of a man who has just opened a very promising door. "Oh, this isn't it," he said cheerfully. "Not even close, actually. I believe I may have taken a wrong turn somewhere around the 4th fold." He paused, peering down at the city below with real interest. "But this is fascinating." "Fascinating," Beerus repeated flatly, "is not food." "No," Whis agreed. "But look, do you feel that?" Beerus, despite himself, felt it. A texture in the air of this world that he did not recognize, a low, constant hum of power, but not the kind he knew, not ki, not divine energy. Something stranger, threaded through nearly everyone below them like a second nervous system, flickering here and there into brief, visible expressions of itself. A man on a nearby street corner whose arms had, for no reason Beerus's senses could parse, simply become longer than they should be. A woman crossing an intersection whose footsteps left small patches of ice behind her, melting in the evening warmth. "What," Beerus said slowly, "is that?" "I have absolutely no idea," Whis said, and he sounded thrilled about it. "Isn't it wonderful? An entire planet of beings who each carry some small, individualized fragment of something. Not ki cultivation, not training, It reads almost like it's simply born into them. He tapped his staff thoughtfully against the rooftop. I don't believe I have ever seen anything quite like it, and I have seen a great many things. That, more than anything, was what made Beerus actually open both eyes and look properly. Whis did not say, I have never seen anything quite like it about trivial matters. Whis had watched the birth and death of galaxies with the same mild interest he now wore looking down at this city. For him to sound surprised meant something. Beerus was, despite 11 billion years of practice at appearing otherwise, curious. He hated being curious. Curiosity implied that something had earned his attention without first earning the right to. Fine, he said, in the tone of a king granting an unwanted audience. We'll stay long enough for you to satisfy your little fascination. Then you find my pudding planet. He surveyed the skyline again, unimpressed, tail flicking. This place had better have something worth eating. At minimum, I'm sure it does, Whis said serenely, already drifting downward, robes catching the wind. Every world does, if you know where to look. They descended toward the city not with any particular ceremony. No grand entrance, no fanfare, no announcement of arrival, because neither of them felt the need for one. Gods did not knock, they simply appeared, and the world adjusted around the fact of them, the way water adjusts around a stone dropped into it. It was, unfortunately for Musutafu, dinner hour. Beerus found the restaurant by scent alone, a small, unassuming place tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered flower shop. Warm yellow light spilling out onto the sidewalk, the smell of something rich and savory drifting into the evening air. He drifted down onto the street outside it in the plain, unbothered way of someone who had simply always been standing there. Whis settling beside him a moment later with the same easy nonchalance. A few pedestrians glanced their way. A small purple catman and a tall, pale figure in flowing robes were, by the standards of a world where a man's arms could apparently extend indefinitely and a woman could freeze the pavement with her footsteps, not even worth a second look. Musutafu had seen stranger. That would not last. Inside, Beerus sat himself at the counter with the easy entitlement of someone who had never once in his existence considered that a seat might not be his to take, and ordered, through a combination of pointing and a low, imperious grunt, the nearest thing on the menu that resembled dessert. What arrived was a small dish of something the restaurant called purin, a soft egg custard with caramel syrup, entirely unremarkable by the standards of a god who had, over the millennia, sampled desserts from 1,000 different worlds. He ate one spoonful. He set the spoon down. This, Beerus said, in a voice of profound, personal betrayal, is an insult. The proprietor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and absolutely no framework for understanding what was happening at his counter, offered a nervous laugh and asked if perhaps the customer would prefer something else on the menu. I would prefer, Beerus said, standing, a competent civilization. It was, in retrospect, a small thing that set it off. It was always a small thing, with Beerus, not malice. Beerus rarely bothered with malice. Malice implied he cared enough to be cruel on purpose, but a kind of cosmic impatience, the particular fury of a being who had waited 4 hours for pudding and received, instead, a mediocre custard in a city he hadn't asked to visit. He stepped back out onto the sidewalk. He looked up at the nearest building, a mid-rise office tower, 40 stories of glass and steel, lit gold from within by a few dozen late workers who had no idea their evening was about to become historic. And he raised one hand, almost lazily, index finger extended, the way a man might point out something mildly interesting to a friend. Beerus, Whis said, in the tone of someone gently reminding a child not to touch a hot stove. Perhaps we shouldn't. Beerus flicked his finger down, once, the smallest possible motion. The upper 30 floors of the tower simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no fire, no falling debris, no groan of collapsing steel. The building did not fall so much as it stopped being there, the way a word stops existing the moment you forget it. One instant 30 floors of glass and light and human lives going about their evening. The next instant, a clean, silent absence where they had been. The remaining 10 floors standing exposed to open sky, like a photograph torn cleanly in half. A soft displacement of air rippled outward, stirring dust and loose papers, and then the street fell into the particular, ringing silence of several hundred people, simultaneously realizing they did not understand what they had just witnessed. Somewhere inside the vanished floors, dozens of workers who 1 heartbeat ago had been staring at their monitors were, 1 heartbeat later, simply gone. Not killed, not injured, not present to be either. The entire mass and matter of 30 stories, excised from the world, as cleanly as if it had never been written into it at all. "Beerus," Whis said again mildly. "That was rather a lot of people." "They were in my line of sight," Beerus said, examining his own fingernail with total indifference, "and I was annoyed." Below them, the screaming had already started. It took Kamui Woods 4 minutes to arrive on scene, moving in long, sweeping arcs between rooftops on limbs of extended wood, and in those 4 minutes, the street outside the ruined tower had become the particular chaos of a city discovering, in real time, that the rules it had trusted had quietly stopped applying. Civilians ran. Emergency channels lit up with reports that made no sense to the people relaying them. "The building's gone, not collapsed, gone. There's no debris. I don't understand what I'm looking at." And at the center of it all, entirely unbothered, stood a small purple creature, and a tall pale one, waiting with the patience of beings who had nowhere else they needed to be. Kamui Woods landed hard on the cracked pavement, 30 feet from them, twin wooden constructs already extending from his forearms, years of hero training screaming at him that this was, by every metric he understood, an active villain encounter, except that nothing about the scene in front of him matched any threat profile he'd ever studied. "Civilians, clear the area," he called out, voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed on sight, before turning his full attention on the 2 figures at the center of the wreckage. "You two, I don't know what that was, but it ends now. Stand down." Beerus turned his head, slowly, and regarded the young man in the tree warrior costume the way one might regard an insect that had wandered somewhere it wasn't wanted. "Is it speaking to me?" he said, "to no one in particular, or is it speaking to itself?" "He's speaking to you," Whis offered helpfully, watching the whole exchange with open, unhurried curiosity. "I believe he intends to fight you." "Does he?" Beerus sounded, for the first time since arriving on this world, genuinely entertained. "That's actually somewhat charming." Kamui Woods didn't wait for further conversation. Wood exploded outward from both his arms in a rapid lattice, snapping through the air toward Beerus in a binding technique that had, over the course of his career, subdued Quirk users considerably stronger than his own frame suggested he should be able to handle. It was fast. It was precise. It was, against nearly anyone in this world, more than sufficient. It reached Beerus and simply stopped being wood. Not broken, not burned. It ceased. The same clean and total absence that had swallowed 30 floors of the tower behind them. The lattice of extending branches winking out of existence a full foot before it would have touched him, leaving Kamui Woods staring at his own outstretched arms, with the specific horror of a man who has just watched part of his own body's output erased from the world without explanation. "That," Beerus said, mildly, "was closer to interesting than the pudding, at least." Kamui Woods took an involuntary step back. He had fought quirks that nullified, quirks that absorbed, quirks that redirected. He had a mental library for all of it, built over years of training and combat, and none of it had a category for the technique simply stopped occurring. Not blocked, not countered, erased from causality, as though it had never been attempted. "What?" he said, and his voice, for all his professional composure, had gone thin. "Is your quirk?" Beerus blinked. It was, in its way, the single strangest sentence anyone had said to him in 11 billion years. He turned the words over, genuinely searching for meaning in them, and found none. "My what?" "Your quirk," Kamui Wood said again, slower, as if speaking to someone who might not share his language, which, in the broadest possible sense, was true. "What you just did, to my wood. What's your ability?" "I don't know what a quirk is," Beerus said, with the particular flatness of a being who genuinely did not care to learn, "and I find I have very little interest in finding out." Whis, floating a few feet away, tilted his head with delighted interest. "Oh, this is the thing I was noticing earlier," he said, mostly to himself. "The little individual power each of you carries. Is that what you call a quirk? How charming a name for it." Kamui Wood stared between them, the small purple god who apparently didn't know what a quirk was, and the tall, serene figure who was treating the deadliest thing he'd ever witnessed like an item of academic curiosity, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man standing at the edge of something far larger than himself, that he needed to call this in. Now, above his own authority, above his own pay grade, above anything the standard protocol had prepared him for, he didn't get the chance to reach for his communicator. Because at that moment, 3 blocks away, a black-haired man in a long gray scarf who had been quietly investigating a separate disturbance, separate, until this exact instant, felt every hair on his body stand on end at a wrongness in the air he couldn't name, looked up, and saw the missing 30 floors of a tower silhouetted against the darkening sky. Shota Aizawa began to run. Behind him a phone was already ringing in Naomasa Tsukauchi's coat pocket, a call that would, within the hour, reach a desk far above street level, in a building where men and women who had never had to categorize a threat like this before would open a file with no name in it yet, and stare at grainy footage of a small purple figure erasing 30 floors of a building with one flick of a finger, and understand, in the particular cold way institutions understand things, that the world they had spent their careers managing had just changed shape without asking permission. Above the wreckage, entirely unaware of, or entirely unbothered by, any of this, Beerus turned back toward Whis with the air of someone concluding a mildly diverting errand. "I still haven't eaten," he said. "No," Whis agreed, smiling. "But I do think we're going to be here for a while." The Hero Public Safety Commission did not, as a rule, convene emergency sessions on the strength of a single incident. Musutafu saw property damage weekly, collapsed buildings, cratered streets, the ordinary collateral of a society that had built its entire civic infrastructure around the assumption that extraordinary violence was simply part of the weather. There were protocols for buildings on fire. There were protocols for buildings that had been punched, thrown, frozen, melted, or turned inside out by a quirk nobody had catalogued yet. There was no protocol for a building that had simply, silently, ceased. By the time the emergency session assembled, 7 officials around a long table in a windowless room 3 floors beneath HPSC headquarters, faces lit blue by a wall of monitors replaying the same 40 seconds of footage from 6 different angles. The analysts had already run the tower's disappearance through every classification system they had. Disintegration, quirks left residue, ash, fine dust, sometimes a smell. Teleportation quirks left displacement, air pressure changes, sound. Even the rarest, most theoretical erasure-type effects on record left something. A shimmer, a discoloration, a trace the sensors could grab hold of. This left nothing. 30 floors of a 40-story building had gone from existing to not existing in a span of time too short for their equipment to properly measure. And the boundary where the building ended was so clean, it looked less like destruction and more like the tower had simply always been 10 stories tall, and reality had briefly forgotten to maintain the lie that it had ever been anything more. "Play it again," said the woman at the head of the table. Mid-50s, iron-gray hair scraped back into a severe knot, a voice that had spent 30 years learning to sound calm while delivering catastrophic news. Her name was on a placard nobody in the room needed to read, frame by frame, from the finger. The footage looped. A small purple figure, barely visible at this resolution, lifted one hand toward the tower with the unhurried ease of a man swatting at a fly. A single downward flick of one finger. 30 floors. Gone. No interval between cause and effect that their cameras could even register as a gap. "There's no delay," said the analyst running the footage, a younger man whose composure had visibly frayed over the last 2 hours. "I've run it at 1,000 times slower. There is no frame where the building is disappearing. There's a frame where it's whole, and the very next frame where it isn't. Whatever this is, it doesn't have a process. It has an instant." Around the table, the 7 officials sat with the specific stillness of people trying not to let their faces show how thoroughly their careers had not prepared them for this. Japan's hero infrastructure had, over the better part of a century, built itself into the most sophisticated Quirk response system on the planet. Ranking systems, containment protocols, a hero license structure that assumed every threat, however extreme, could eventually be sorted into a category, assessed for weaknesses, and matched against an appropriate countermeasure. All for One had taken them decades to properly understand, and even he had mechanics, rules, a power that, however monstrous, obeyed cause and effect in ways that could eventually be studied, predicted, planned against. This had none of that. This had a being who looked, on camera, faintly bored while unmaking 30 floors of inhabited building as an afterthought. "Casualties," the gray-haired woman said. "Unknown," the analyst said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. That's the part I can't get past. There's no bodies, no blood, no structural debris with human remains in it. Nothing for the recovery teams to even process. 41 people were in those floors according to the building registry. They didn't die in any sense our system has a form for. They were simply subtracted. Silence settled over the room, the particular silence of people who have just understood, all at once, that the vocabulary they'd need to discuss this properly did not yet exist. "Get me Eraserhead," the woman finally said. "He's already on scene. I want a direct assessment, not second-hand reporting. And get me every available rank 1 through rank 5 hero within response range of Musutafu. Quietly, no press notification. If this thing decides to do that again, I want more than one Kamui Woods standing in front of it." Aizawa arrived on the ruined street, 11 minutes after Kamui Woods' initial call. Capture weapon already half unwound from his shoulders, red eyes glowing faintly with the particular exhaustion of a man who had erased more quirks in his career than most heroes had ever seen used. He took in the scene in the practiced half-second scan of someone who had learned, the hard way, that the first look at a crisis was usually the only clear one he'd get before the adrenaline started narrowing his focus. A small purple figure, a tall pale one, floating an inch above the cracked pavement, as though gravity were a suggestion he'd elected not to take personally. Kamui Woods a dozen feet back, wooden constructs still extended but no longer advancing, wearing the specific stillness of a man who had already learned something that had scared him more than the initial attack. "Report," Aizawa said, low, not taking his eyes off the two figures. "His quirk," Kamui Woods started, then stopped himself, correcting mid-sentence with visible difficulty. "Whatever that is, it's not a quirk. I hit him with a full binding lattice, point-blank range. It didn't get blocked. It didn't get countered. It just stopped, mid-air, before contact, like it unhappened." Aizawa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd built an entire career, an entire identity, around a single power, the ability to erase quirks with a look, so long as he kept his eyes open and his focus locked. It was the reason he was standing on this street at all. The Commission's default answer, whenever something unclassified showed up, was send the man who can turn it off. He looked at Beerus. He activated his quirk. Nothing happened, which was, in itself, informative. Aizawa's erasure worked on nearly everything the quirk taxonomy had ever produced, silent and total the instant his eyes locked on, and he had learned over the years to read the texture of failure when it occurred. A quirk that resisted him usually did so with effort. A flicker, a strain, the target visibly working to hold their power together against the pressure of his gaze. This produced none of that. There was no resistance because there was, as far as Aizawa's power could determine, nothing there to erase. His quirk searched for the specific signature that every quirk in existence carried, the genetic, biological thread his ability hooked into, and found, in the small purple figure standing across the street, simply nothing that matched. Not a quirk being defended, not a quirk too strong to erase. The absence of a category his power even recognized as a target. Beerus, for his part, felt Aizawa's gaze land on him with the vague, faintly itching sensation of someone trying a key in a lock that had never been built to accept it, and turned toward him with an expression of mild, dawning interest, the first true curiosity he'd shown since arriving. "You," Beerus said. "You just tried something." "I did," Aizawa said, keeping his voice level through what was, internally, the specific cold spike of a man, realizing his single most reliable tool in any crisis had simply failed to register a target at all. Didn't work. "No," Beerus agreed, tail flicking with something almost like approval. "It didn't. Whatever you were reaching for, it isn't there. I'm not sure what you expected to find." He tilted his head, studying Aizawa now with real attention for the first time. "That's the second time in 10 minutes someone on this rock has assumed I operate on the same rules as everyone else here. It's beginning to annoy me, because everyone here does operate on the same rules," Aizawa said, carefully, buying time, cataloging everything about the exchange for the report he'd have to file within the hour. "Everyone born on this planet has a quirk. One power, one person. It's how the world works." "Is it?" Beerus said, and something in his tone had shifted. Not anger, not yet, but the specific dry edge of a god listening to a very small creature explain the rules of a very small world with total, unearned confidence. "How wonderful. A whole planet, and every single one of you has decided the rules you were born under are the rules that govern everything." Whis, floating nearby, chimed in with the mild helpfulness of a man offering directions. "It really is a fascinating system, if you don't mind my saying," he told Aizawa pleasantly. "Every individual granted some unique fragment of ability, inherited and combined generation over generation. I've seen power systems built on training, on bloodlines, on artifacts, on pacts, but rarely one quite this, democratized. Practically everyone gets something." He said it the way a naturalist might describe an unusually interesting species of beetle. Aizawa did not relax his stance, but a very small, very buried part of his mind, the part that had spent a career treating every new threat as a puzzle to be understood before it could be neutralized, filed away the phrase "not born with a quirk" and understood, with the particular clarity that came right before things got significantly worse, that whatever these two were, they weren't native to any framework his world had ever built. "What are you?" Aizawa said. Not a challenge, a genuine question. Beerus considered him for a long moment, tail twitching once, and for a fraction of a second, brief enough that only Whis, who had known him for longer than this planet had existed, caught it. Something almost like reluctant respect crossed his face. Most creatures on this world so far had either fled or attacked. This one had done neither. This one had tried something, watched it fail, and asked the actual question, instead of pretending he already had the answer. "I am the reason your civilization continues to exist," Beerus said, "though it has done very little, so far, to earn that." It was not an explanation. Aizawa understood it wasn't meant to be one. It was, instead, the kind of sentence a being said when he expected the listener to simply accept its weight without needing it justified. The way you didn't ask the sun to explain why it rose. And the worst part, the part Aizawa would spend the rest of the night turning over in his mind, was that some old animal instinct beneath his training believed it immediately and completely. The same instinct that made a small animal go still when something far larger than itself walked into the clearing. "Sir," Aizawa said, and it cost him something, professionally, to use the word. But he'd learned a long time ago that survival mattered more than pride. "I'd like to request that you not do that again, to another building." There were people in it. Beerus's tail went still. For a moment, nobody on the street moved. Kamui Woods, still holding his ready stance a dozen feet back, felt the temperature of the moment shift in a way he couldn't have named if asked. Whis's cheerful expression didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders sharpened. Attentive, watching his companion, with the specific care of someone who had, across 11 billion years, learned exactly how narrow the gap could be between Beerus's boredom and Beerus's temper. "There were people in it," Beerus repeated, slowly, and something in the words had gone very quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. "You think I don't know that? You think, small creature, that in 11 billion years I have somehow failed to notice when there are people in the things I erase?" "I don't know what you've noticed," Aizawa said, holding his ground though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run. "I know 41 people are gone, and their families don't have a body to bury. I know that's a fact, regardless of how old you are, or what you think you're the reason for." The silence that followed was the longest of Aizawa's life. Then, unexpectedly, Beerus laughed. A short, sharp, genuinely surprised sound, more startled than amused. "Whis," he said, not taking his eyes off Aizawa. "This one has a spine. That's actually rather rare, you know. Most things that stand this close to me lose the ability to speak in complete sentences." "He does seem to be managing remarkably well," Whis agreed, sounding delighted. "I'm not managing," Aizawa said flatly. "I'm terrified. I'm just better at hiding it than most people." That, for reasons neither Aizawa nor anyone else on the street could have fully explained, seemed to genuinely please Beerus. His tail resumed its idle flick, the dangerous stillness of a moment ago, dissolving back into ordinary, bored impatience, and he looked away from Aizawa entirely, back toward the ruined tower, as though the conversation had already exhausted its usefulness to him. "Fine," Beerus said. "I won't erase another one of your buildings today, not because you asked nicely, because I'm bored of this street, and I still haven't eaten anything worth the trip." He glanced sideways at Whis. "Find me something on this rock that doesn't taste like a punishment, and I'll consider not destroying anything else until sundown." "I have several ideas already," Whis said brightly. Behind them, Aizawa exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, keyed his communicator with a hand that was not quite steady, and relayed 4 words to the commission that would end up quoted in the incident report for years afterward. He said, "For now." It was, by any measure, the single least reassuring update anyone at HPSC had received all year, and it was, nonetheless, the best news anyone on that street had gotten since the tower disappeared. By midnight, the crater where the tower had stood was cordoned off behind 3 concentric rings of hero agency tape, floodlights, and armed HPSC field units, who had been given instructions so vague they amounted, in practice, to observe and do not. Under any circumstances, engage. News helicopters circled at a distance the commission had mandated by emergency decree. Their footage delayed 40 minutes before broadcast, so government censors could scrub anything that might cause a public panic beyond what 41 silent disappearances had already guaranteed. 3 floors beneath HPSC headquarters, the emergency session had not adjourned. It had simply grown, table by table, chair by chair, as more of the commission's senior staff were pulled from their beds and briefed in hallways on their way into the room, until what had begun as 7 officials around a monitor wall had become nearly 30 people arguing, in the particular hushed, controlled tones of professionals trying not to sound as frightened as they felt, about how to categorize a god. "We don't have a box for this," said a balding man near the end of the table, a specialist in Quirk taxonomy, who had built his entire career cataloging the 8,000-some documented ability types in Japan alone. "I've run every parameter we have. Emitter, transformation, mutant. None of it fits." Aizawa's report is unambiguous. His erasure didn't fail against a resistant target. It failed to find a target at all. "Then we build a new box," said the gray-haired woman at the head of the table. Director Tsuragami's second-in-command, a woman named Kaoru Enji, who had spent the last decade quietly running threat assessment for exactly this kind of nightmare scenario, and had never, in her worst projections, imagined one arriving with this little warning. "I don't care what we call it. I care what we do with it. Options. Now." The room produced them slowly, reluctantly, each one sounding worse than the last once spoken aloud. Containment was the first, and the first to die in committee. Nobody in that room had forgotten the footage. 30 floors erased in less time than their sensors could measure. No delay between intention and effect. Whatever contained a threat like that didn't exist in Japan's arsenal, and building it in time to matter was not a plan. It was a fantasy. Evacuation was the second. Quietly move Musutafu's population out from under whatever this thing's temper radius turned out to be, and it died almost as fast, for the simple, brutal reason that you couldn't evacuate a city of over 2 million people without the god in question noticing, and nobody in the room wanted to guess what a being who erased buildings out of boredom might do if he felt his new toy was being taken away from him. The third option was the one nobody wanted to say first, because saying it first meant owning the political fallout if it went wrong. "We talked to it," said a younger analyst near the back, and when the room didn't immediately shout her down, she pressed on, emboldened. Aizawa's field report says it responded to direct address. It didn't attack him for approaching. It engaged in conversation. It made, and I want to stress this is in the transcript verbatim, it made what sounded like a joke. This isn't a natural disaster. It isn't a rampaging villain running on instinct. Whatever it is, it thinks, and it appears to value being spoken to like something capable of thought in return. You want to send a diplomat to negotiate with something that erased 41 people for standing in the wrong building, said the taxonomy specialist, incredulous. I want to send someone who won't get all of us killed by treating a god like a villain, the analyst shot back. Every option on this table that leads with force assumes we can win a fight we don't understand the rules of. Aizawa's report says this thing responded to being asked not to hurt people more than it responded to being threatened. That's not nothing. That's the only lever we've been handed so far, and I'd rather pull it carefully than not pull it at all. Enji was quiet for a long moment, weighing 30 years of instinct that told her every option on the table was a gamble, and choosing, finally, the one that didn't require pretending Japan's hero infrastructure could win a war it had no framework for. Aizawa stays on scene as primary contact, she said. He's already established some kind of rapport, if you can call it that, and I'm not risking a personnel change this thing might read as an escalation. Pair him with Tsukauchi. I want a lie detector in the room the moment this thing says anything that sounds like a demand or a promise. No hero response teams visible unless summoned. No aggressive posturing. And get me Principal Nezu on a secure line within the hour. Nezu, someone repeated, surprised. Why UA? Because, Enji said, already standing, already moving toward the door with the particular grim momentum of a woman who had run out of good options and settled for the least bad one. If this thing decides it's curious rather than hostile, I want the single sharpest analytical mind in this country's hero system in the room before it decides to go find something curious on its own. She did not know, when she said it, how prophetic the timing would turn out to be. Whis found UA an hour and 40 minutes later, entirely by accident, in the particular way that things which are not looking for something specific tend to stumble directly into the most interesting thing available. Beerus had, after some negotiation and a memorable detour through 4 different restaurants, 2 of which he'd left in a state of vague, unspoken menace after their desserts failed to impress him, one of which had produced a matcha parfait that earned a rare, grudging nod of approval, finally settled into a state of temporary satisfaction, curled on the roof of a quiet apartment building on the edge of the city, tail wrapped around himself, dozing with the specific ease of a being who considered sleep a right rather than a necessity. Whis, needing considerably less rest and possessing an attention span that could hold an entire afternoon's worth of curiosity without tiring, had drifted off to explore on his own, staff in hand, robes catching the cool night wind as he floated at rooftop height across the sleeping city. It was the wall that caught his attention first. Tall, pale, gleaming faintly under security floodlights, ringed with a density of protective ability signatures that Whis, whose senses cataloged power the way other beings cataloged color, found genuinely remarkable. Dozens of distinct, layered defensive fields threaded through the structure, some active, some dormant, all of them woven with a precision that suggested careful design rather than natural growth. "Oh," Whis said, to no one, delighted. "Now that's interesting." He drifted lower, past the outer wall, over training grounds still lit for late-night maintenance work, past a massive central building shaped, he noted with real amusement, rather like a stylized letter U. Banners hung from several structures bearing the same phrase over and over, Plus Ultra, which Whis turned over in his mind with the pleasure of a man collecting a new phrase for later use. He passed dormitories, quiet at this hour, a handful of windows still lit, where students who should have been asleep were, evidently, still awake doing whatever it was young hopeful heroes did at 1 in the morning. He found what he was looking for near the center of the campus, a cluttered, book-lined office on an upper floor, lights still burning, and inside it, hunched over a cluttered desk stacked with files, a small white mouse bear dog creature with sharp, intelligent eyes that lifted the instant Whis's presence crossed the threshold of the window, well before Whis had made any sound at all to announce himself. "You're not on any visitor log," the creature said pleasantly, setting down his pen without any visible alarm. "And you didn't use a door. That's either very rude or very informative. I'm inclined to think it's the second one." Whis smiled, genuinely charmed. "How wonderful. You noticed me before I'd decided how to introduce myself. I make a habit of noticing things quickly," the creature said. "It tends to keep me alive. Principal Nezu, though I suspect you already know that, given you found your way to my office rather than the front gate." He studied Whis with open, unhurried interest, tilting his head. "You're not registered to any Quirk database I have access to, and believe me, I have access to a great many. And you arrived here the same night my city lost 30 floors of a building to something with no cause and effect delay. I don't believe in coincidence, mister." "Whis," Whis said, settling onto the windowsill with the easy grace of someone accepting an invitation that hadn't technically been offered yet. "And you're quite right not to believe in it. Though I should say, the building was rather more my companion's doing than mine. He gets restless when hungry. It's one of his less charming qualities, among a great many charming ones, if you know where to look. Your companion, Nezu repeated slowly, being the small purple figure currently sleeping on a rooftop 3 kilometers from here, according to the last satellite pass. You do move quickly, Whis said, genuinely impressed. Yes, Beerus, how shall I put this in terms that will land properly? He's a god of destruction. It's not a title he claims lightly, or even really claims at all. It's simply, factually, what he is. One of several, across a rather larger structure of universes than I suspect this world currently has any framework for. Nezu did not, to his considerable credit, so much as blink. He folded his small paws together atop his desk and regarded Whis with the specific stillness of a mind processing an enormous quantity of new information and finding, somehow, room to store all of it without panic. And you? If he destroys, what do you do? I attend him, Whis said simply. I teach him. I occasionally stop him from doing something he'd regret, on the rare occasions he's capable of regret. And, he added, glancing out toward the sprawling campus behind him with unmistakable, genuine delight, I find myself extraordinarily curious about all of this. Your quirks, your hero rankings, your license system, your training academies, this entire remarkable civic structure you've built around teaching children to wield uncontrolled biological weapons responsibly. I have visited a great many worlds, Principal Nezu, across a great many timelines, and I don't believe I have ever seen one that handed such power to its ordinary citizens quite so democratically. It has its costs, Nezu said carefully, still watching Whis with the wary attentiveness of a chess player facing an opponent whose opening move he didn't yet understand. Everything does, Whis agreed pleasantly. That's rather what makes it worth studying. There was a silence between them, comfortable on Whis's part, and considerably less so on Nezu's, before the small creature spoke again, choosing his next words with visible, deliberate care. I'll be direct with you, Whis, because I suspect you'd see through anything less. 41 of my country's citizens are dead tonight because your companion was hungry and unimpressed with a dessert menu. I don't know what a god of destruction's morality looks like, and I confess I'm frightened to learn. But I do know this city, and this world, cannot survive many more nights like this one. So I have to ask you plainly, is he going to do it again? Whis considered the question with real, unhurried seriousness, the playful curiosity in his expression settling, for the first time since he'd arrived, into something closer to honesty. I won't lie to you, Principal Nezu, because I think you'd know if I did. Beerus destroys things when they bore him, or annoy him, or fail to justify their existence in whatever way currently matters to him. It's not cruelty, precisely. It's closer to a kind of cosmic judgment, the terrible privilege of a being whose opinion of a thing's worth is, quite literally, the only thing standing between that thing and oblivion. He paused. But I will also tell you this, because it's equally true. Beerus does not destroy without reason, even if his reasons are often small ones by your standards. And he has, on more occasions across more worlds than you might expect, chosen not to destroy a planet he found sufficiently interesting. And is this planet interesting to him? Nezu asked, very quietly. Whis smiled, and this time there was something almost fond in it. He hasn't left yet, he said. For Beerus, that's practically a love letter. Nezu absorbed this with the particular stillness of a man recalculating an entire strategic framework in real time, and reached, slowly, for the phone on his desk. Then I imagine, he said, we had better find out what would keep him interested, before something reminds him he'd rather be bored somewhere else. Morning arrived over Musutafu with the particular, surreal calm of a city that had spent the night rehearsing every possible version of its own ending and had, somehow, woken up to find itself still standing. The news networks, released at last from their censorship delay, ran the tower footage on a loop between hastily assembled panels of hero analysts who had no better answers than the government had the night before. Public statements from the commission were carefully, deliberately vague. A high-priority, unregistered entity had been responsible for the incident. Response was ongoing and coordinated. Citizens were asked to remain calm and avoid the cordon district. Nobody used the word God. Nobody was ready to. Aizawa had not slept. He stood now at the edge of the cordon with a cup of convenience store coffee going cold in his hand, watching a small purple figure sit cross-legged on a rooftop across the street, apparently doing nothing at all except radiating the specific, bone-deep impatience of someone waiting for the world to become more interesting. Beside him, Tsukauchi finished a phone call and pocketed his own device with the tired economy of a man who had made this exact call 4 times already that morning. Commission wants Nezu's read before they commit to a formal contact protocol, he said. He's requesting we bring the attendant, Whis, to campus, instead of running this through the usual channels. Says he's already had contact. Already, Aizawa repeated flat. Apparently the attendant let himself into his office around 1 a.m. Nezu says he was, and I'm quoting directly, unusually forthcoming, for a being who could presumably kill me by breathing wrong. Tsukauchi allowed himself the ghost of a tired smile. He wants to meet the other one properly, on campus, on his terms, where he says he can control variables better than an open street. Aizawa looked back across the cordon at Beerus, still sitting motionless on the rooftop, tail flicking with the rhythm of a man counting down the minutes until his patience expired. You want to invite a god of destruction to a school full of children. I want, Tsukauchi said, to put him somewhere with enough interesting things happening that he doesn't get bored and erase another building. Nezu's argument, not mine. Apparently gods get destructive when nothing holds their attention. UA's got over 100 kids actively training right now. That's a lot of attention to hold. It was. Aizawa reflected privately. The single strangest sentence anyone had said to him in a 19-year hero career, built almost entirely around minimizing risk to civilians. And it was also, infuriatingly, the first plan all night that hadn't sounded like a fantasy. Getting Beerus to UA was, in the end, considerably easier than anyone expected, and for a reason that had nothing to do with diplomacy. There's food there, Whis explained to Aizawa, entirely without irony, when the two of them met at the cordon's edge an hour later. A cafeteria, I understand, run for hundreds of students, different cuisines throughout the week. I mentioned it to him this morning and he was, well, interested, undersells it. He asked if the pudding would be better than last night's, which I took as a very good sign. You're telling me the god of destruction is coming to a hero academy because of the cafeteria, Aizawa said, in the voice of a man whose entire worldview had quietly stopped making sense somewhere around 3 that morning and had not yet found its footing again. I'm telling you, Whis said, smiling, that Beerus's priorities are simpler than most civilizations expect, once you understand them. Feed him well, keep him entertained, and he is, genuinely, one of the more reasonable beings I've had the privilege of attending. Fail on either count, and things become considerably more complicated. It was, Aizawa thought grimly, possibly the most important piece of tactical intelligence anyone had handed the commission in 24 hours, and it had come wrapped in a sentence about pudding. Nezu received them personally at the front gate, flanked by 2 members of staff who had been read into just enough of the situation to be useful and not enough to fully panic. Present Mike, whose booming presence Nezu judged might read as friendly rather than threatening, and Midnight, whose composure under pressure he trusted more than almost anyone else on faculty. Beerus arrived floating a foot above the pavement, tail swishing with mild, undisguised curiosity as he took in the sprawling campus, the U-shaped central building, the distant hum of training grounds already active with the noise of 100 students burning off the morning's excess energy. This, Beerus announced, to no one in particular, had better have decent food, or I'm leaving before lunch. I can personally guarantee the cafeteria, Nezu said, stepping forward with no visible hesitation, extending a small paw toward a being who had erased 41 people the night before with a single flick of his finger. Principal Nezu, welcome to UA. Beerus looked down at the paw, then at the creature offering it, with an expression of open, genuine surprise. The first thing on this world, aside from Aizawa's earlier spine, that had actually caught him off guard. You're not afraid of me, he observed. I am extremely afraid of you, Nezu said pleasantly. I've simply found, over the course of a long career, that fear and hospitality aren't mutually exclusive. Shall we walk? I'd love to show you the campus before lunch. I think you'll find it more interesting than you expect. Something about the sheer, unbothered confidence of the offer. A small, fragile-looking creature calmly inviting a god to tour his school as though hosting royalty, rather than placating a catastrophe, seemed to genuinely delight Beerus, and he fell into step beside Nezu with the loose, unhurried gait of a predator who had decided, for the moment, that the situation amused him more than it annoyed him. They had not gone 20 feet before the first collision happened. A group of first years, released from morning training and cutting across the courtyard toward the dormitories, rounded the corner mid-conversation and walked directly into the sight of a small purple cat god strolling beside their principal, flanked by 2 of their teachers and a tall, serene figure in flowing robes. The group, 5 students, mid-argument about lunch plans, stopped dead, the way anyone stops when their brain briefly refuses to process what their eyes are reporting. One of them, a green-haired boy with a nervous, earnest energy that seemed constitutionally incapable of staying quiet in the presence of something new, took an involuntary step forward before his friend could grab his sleeve. That's the thing from the news, he said, half to himself, eyes wide, already muttering under his breath in the rapid-fire cadence of someone whose brain had started analyzing before his mouth had caught up. The building, no delay, no residue. That's not possible for any known erasure category, unless it's operating on a completely different Midoriya, Aizawa said, in the flat, warning tone of a teacher who had spent a full year learning exactly how fast this particular student could talk himself into danger. Don't. Too late. Beerus had already turned his head, one ear flicking toward the muttering boy with the mild, predatory interest of something noticing movement in tall grass. He studied Midoriya for a moment. The wide eyes, the barely restrained excitement fighting against obvious terror, the visible effort of a young man trying to categorize something his entire framework had no box for, and found, apparently, the whole display rather entertaining. You, Beerus said, small green one, you have something to say. Say it properly, instead of muttering it at your own shoes. Midoriya froze. Every student behind him froze harder. Aizawa's hand drifted, very slightly, toward the capture weapon at his shoulder, though even he understood, on some instinctive level, that it would do exactly nothing if this went wrong. Sorry, Midoriya managed. I was trying to figure out your quirk. From what happened last night. The building, I mean. There's no known quirk that erases matter with 0 causal delay, not even the most powerful emitter types on record. So I was trying to work out if it's a new subcategory or... My what? Beerus said. The question landed with the specific, total blankness of a man who had genuinely never encountered the word before, and it took Midoriya, along with everyone else in earshot, a full 3 seconds to understand that this was not rhetorical. Your Quirk, Midoriya repeated, slower, the way you might repeat a word to someone learning a new language. Your ability, your power, what lets you do things like last night. Beerus turned to Whis with an expression of genuine, aggrieved confusion. Is this a local custom? Everyone on this rock keeps asking me the same nonsense question, as though the answer should be self-evident. What is a quirk? It's what they call their individual abilities, Whis explained, clearly enjoying himself immensely. Every person on this world is born with one, a unique fragment of power, inherited, sometimes combined from both parents. I did mention it, dear. You may simply not have been listening. I was busy being hungry, Beerus said, with total lack of remorse, before turning back to the small crowd of frozen students, with the particular, dangerous patience of a being, deciding whether a question deserved an actual answer, or simply annoyed him. I don't have a quirk, he said, finally, enunciating the unfamiliar word with faint distaste, as though it tasted wrong in his mouth. I am not born of this world, small creature, and whatever governs the little powers you all seem to be obsessed with categorizing has nothing to do with what I am. Then what? What are you? Midoriya asked, and this time the question came out steadier, driven less by fear than by the specific, helpless curiosity of a boy who had spent his entire life believing every extraordinary thing in the world could eventually be explained if you studied it hard enough. Beerus considered him for a long moment. Something about the boy's total lack of guile, no calculation, no political angle, just pure, unfiltered need to understand, seemed to strike him as genuinely novel among the various nervous, careful reactions he'd received since arriving. I am the one who decides, Beerus said, whether worlds like this one continue to exist. He let that settle, watching with open interest as the color drained from several faces around him. So far, this one is mildly promising. Try not to change my opinion of it before lunch. He turned, tail swishing, and continued walking beside Nezu, as though the entire exchange had been a minor, faintly amusing detour, leaving behind a courtyard full of first-year students, standing in the specific, ringing silence of people who had just learned, all at once, that their entire species was currently on trial, and the judge was hungry. Midoriya, notebook already half out of his bag despite every survival instinct screaming that this was not the moment, turned to Aizawa with wide, urgent eyes. Sensei, he whispered, I need to know everything about that. No, Aizawa said, already walking after Beerus, already exhausted in a way sleep would not fix. You need to survive lunch. Everything else comes after. The UA cafeteria at midday operated on a scale most civilian restaurants would have found unmanageable. 300 students moving through in staggered waves, a kitchen staff led by a hero chef whose culinary quirk turned ordinary preparation into something closer to performance art, and a noise level that rarely dipped below cheerful chaos. Nezu had, with characteristic foresight, arranged for Beerus, Whis, and their small escort to be seated at a private table along the room's upper tier, angled to give a clear view of the room without putting either god directly in the flow of foot traffic, a compromise between hospitality and the very real possibility that an accidentally jostled god might respond poorly to being jostled. It proved, within the first 10 minutes, to be one of the single best decisions anyone at UA had made in the last 24 hours. Lunch arrived, an elaborate, multi-course spread the head chef had thrown together on Nezu's direct and urgently worded instruction. Everything from delicate tempura to a rich, slow-simmered curry, to, at the very end, a small dish of house-made purin that had clearly been prepared with considerably more care than the establishment from the night before. Beerus ate the first course in total silence, methodical and unreadable, while Nezu, Aizawa, and Tsukauchi, watched with the specific tension of people grading an exam they couldn't see the answer key for. He reached the pudding last. He ate one spoonful. He set the spoon down with a small, considering click. "Better," he announced. The exhale that went around the table was audible. "I'll take better as a diplomatic victory," Nezu said, folding his paws together with the faint, genuine relief of a man who had just watched an international incident narrowly avoided by custard. "I confess I was hoping for slightly higher praise, but I'll accept incremental progress." "Don't get comfortable," Beerus said, though there was, for the first time, something almost approaching ease in his posture. Shoulders less coiled, tail resting rather than lashing. "It's better than a punishment. That's not the same as good." "Duly noted," Nezu said. "I'll have the kitchen keep trying." It was Whis, however, who was having the better afternoon by a considerable margin. While Beerus ate, the angel had drifted his attention out across the cafeteria floor, watching the ordinary churn of student life with the rapt, delighted focus of a man watching a nature documentary come to life around him. A pair of students at a nearby table, arm wrestling, using visibly mismatched quirks, one of them apparently able to harden his skin at will, the other seemingly unaffected by pain of any kind. A trio near the window running through what looked like informal training drills between bites of lunch, small bursts of flame and ice trading back and forth with the casual ease of children playing catch. "May I ask something that might seem forward?" Whis said, turning back to Nezu with open curiosity. "Given the last 24 hours, Nezu said dryly, "I don't believe forward is a word that applies to much anymore." "Ask away." "Your quirks," Whis said. "Are they always inherited whole from a parent, or do they combine? I noticed the boy in the courtyard this morning. Midoriya, was it? Seemed to have no ability visibly active around him at all, and yet you all treated his presence as entirely unremarkable. Whereas I've now seen at least 4 students in this room manifesting abilities that would, on most worlds I've visited, mark them as considerable individual talents in their own right, and they're using them to arm wrestle." Nezu's ears twitched with the specific pleasure of a man being asked a genuinely good question. "It's more complicated than either pure inheritance or pure combination," he said. "Roughly 80% of the population manifests some form of quirk by early childhood, generally derived from a blend of both parents' traits, though the specific expression can vary wildly and unpredictably. The remaining 20% are considered quirkless, no manifest ability at all." He paused, glancing briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the cafeteria doors, though Midoriya was nowhere in sight. "It's a harder road for those born that way. Society hasn't always been kind to them." "Fascinating," Whis said, and meant it, tilting his head with real interest. "So it's not a meritocracy of raw power, precisely, but a society organized around an assumption of universal ability, with real consequences for the minority who fall outside that assumption." "That's a more elegant summary than most of our own sociologists manage," Nezu said. "Yes, that's more or less exactly the shape of it." Beerus, who had been half listening while working through a second helping of curry, made a small, considering noise. "That boy this morning," he said, "the green one who wouldn't stop talking. He's one of your quirkless." Every adult at the table went very still. "He is," Nezu said carefully, watching Beerus's face for any sign of where this was headed. "Or was, technically. It's a somewhat more complicated case than most, though I'd rather not discuss the specifics of a student's private circumstances without his consent." "I'm not asking for gossip," Beerus said, faintly annoyed at the implication. "I'm asking because he stood in front of a god who had erased 41 people the night before, and, instead of running, tried to figure out how I did it. On your world, apparently, that's rare enough to be worth remarking on." He set down his spoon, considering. "Where I come from, Most beings without power learn very quickly to make themselves useful in other ways, or they don't survive long enough to matter. That one didn't seem to know he wasn't supposed to be brave. He's had practice, Aizawa said, quietly. The first thing he'd volunteered all lunch. More than most kids his age should have needed. Beerus glanced at him, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and let the subject drop, though Whis, watching his companion with the particular attentiveness of someone who had spent 11 billion years learning to read every flicker of Beerus's mood, filed the moment away as significant. Beerus rarely asked follow-up questions about individuals. He'd asked two, in the space of a single lunch, about a quirkless boy who talked too fast and hadn't had the sense to be properly afraid. The conversation drifted from there, Nezu, sensing an opening, steering gently toward broader questions about the hero system itself, the licensing structure, the ranking boards, the delicate civic architecture built around channeling extraordinary power into socially sanctioned outlets. Whis absorbed all of it with open fascination, occasionally interjecting with comparisons to other worlds he'd observed, civilizations built on raw strength hierarchies, on inherited nobility, on martial tournaments that decided political power outright, each comparison drawing out, gradually, more of Nezu's own careful analysis of what made this system durable and what made it fragile. Beerus, for his part, listened with the detached, evaluative air of a being conducting an audit, rather than making conversation, occasionally cutting in with a question so blunt it nearly derailed the table each time. "So your strongest fighters," he said, at one point, "spend their time rescuing cats from trees and posing for cameras, while your actual monsters, the ones who'd burn all of this down given the chance, operate mostly in the dark, underestimated by the system built to catch them." Nezu's ears flattened, very slightly. "That's an uncharitable, but not entirely inaccurate summary, yes. Uncharitable and accurate aren't mutually exclusive," Beerus said, echoing, without apparent irony, Nezu's own words back at him. "I've seen the pattern before. Civilizations that reward performance over substance tend to produce very good performers and very poor emergencies." He picked the last spoonful of pudding clean, set the dish aside, and regarded Nezu with an expression that had, somewhere in the last hour, shifted from pure judgment into something closer to genuine, if still condescending, interest. "You know that about your own system. That's the only reason I haven't already decided this place is a waste of my afternoon. I'd like to think," Nezu said carefully, "that knowing your own flaws is the necessary first step toward correcting them." "Knowing is the easy part," Beerus said. "Most things that know their own flaws still don't fix them. That's usually when I get involved." The table went quiet again. The specific, careful quiet of people recalibrating exactly how much danger remained in the room, and Whis, sensing, as he so often did, the precise moment a conversation needed rescuing from his companion's bluntness, set his cup down with a small, cheerful clink. "Well," he said brightly, "I for one think this has been a marvelous lunch, and I'd very much like to see more of your training facilities before the day's out, if that's not too forward a request. I understand there's a rather famous gymnasium here, the one with the differentiated environmental zones. I do so love a well-designed training ground." Nezu, grateful for the redirect, seized it with both paws. "Ground Beta," he said. "I'd be delighted to arrange a tour." In fact, a small, calculating gleam entered his eye, the look of a strategist who had just found an opening he hadn't expected to get so soon. "I wonder if your companion might be interested in observing a live training exercise. We have several second-year students running combat simulations this afternoon. I suspect it might answer a great many of his questions about what this world's heroes are actually capable of." Beerus's tail flicked, interest sharpening behind his half-lidded eyes. "Now that," he said, standing, "is the first genuinely useful thing anyone's suggested since I got here." Aizawa, watching the god of destruction rise from the table with the loose, unhurried energy of a predator that had just been handed something to actually watch, felt the specific, sinking certainty that Nezu had just traded one kind of danger for another, and that whatever happened in ground beta this afternoon, it was going to end up in a great many incident reports. Ground beta occupied nearly a third of UA's training campus, a vast, segmented arena capable of reshaping itself into a dozen distinct biomes at the flip of a control panel. From Arctic tundra to urban ruin to dense artificial jungle, all of it built to give students combat experience against terrain their quirks couldn't simply outpower. Today's exercise, already scheduled before any god had entered anyone's afternoon, had second years running a 2-on-2 combat simulation through the urban ruin sector. Collapsed concrete, twisted rebar, narrow sightlines, the specific chaos of a battlefield built to punish anyone who relied on a single trick. Nezu arranged the observation platform with characteristic precision, an elevated gallery overlooking the arena, out of the combat zone but close enough to see everything. Staff pulled from 3 departments on short notice to monitor sensors and, more quietly, to be ready to intervene the instant anything went wrong. What intervene could possibly mean, given the guests in attendance? Nobody on the platform had a satisfying answer for. Beerus took a seat on the gallery railing, with the loose, proprietary ease of a king, settling into a box seat, tail curling around the metal, eyes already tracking the 4 students moving into position below. Whis floated beside him, staff resting against his shoulder, wearing the expression of a man settling in for a performance he expected to genuinely enjoy. "Explain the rules," Beerus said, without looking away from the arena. 2 teams of 2, Nezu said, joining him at the rail. Objective is capture or incapacitation of the opposing team's designated target within the terrain. No lethal force permitted. It's meant to simulate real hero encounters, villain apprehension in urban collateral risk zones. So they're not trying to kill each other. Correct. Then how do you know which of them is actually dangerous? Beerus asked, and there was something genuinely probing in the question. Less bored provocation than real analytical interest. A creature that holds back never shows you its true measure. You only learn what something is capable of when it stops pretending it has limits. Nezu's ears twitched, the specific reaction of a strategist recognizing, in an unlikely source, a genuinely sharp point. That's a fair criticism of controlled training environments generally, he admitted. Though I'd argue the restraint itself is part of what we're testing. Any quirk can be dangerous unrestrained. What separates a hero from a threat is often precisely the discipline to hold power back until it's needed. Beerus made a low, considering noise, filing the answer away without fully accepting or rejecting it, and returned his full attention to the arena as the simulation's start klaxon sounded below. The match that followed was, by any professional standard, a genuinely good one. 4 second years putting real skill and creativity into a scenario built to reward exactly that. A boy with an explosion-based quirk used controlled bursts to propel himself across collapsed terrain at speeds that shouldn't have been survivable, closing distance faster than his opponents could adjust. His partner, a quieter girl whose ability let her manipulate sound into disorienting waves, laid down cover that scrambled the opposing team's communication at precisely the moments it mattered most. Their opponents adapted, one erecting hardened barriers from his own skin to buy time, the other using an insect swarm quirk to scout blind corners the explosion user's speed had turned into liabilities. Whis watched with unbroken, delighted attention, occasionally murmuring small observations to himself. Oh, clever. Using the sound to mask his approach rather than simply overpower. Ah, she's using the swarm defensively now. Good instinct. The pure appreciation of a martial arts instructor, Watching genuinely competent students work, Beerus watched differently. He watched the way a general watches a battlefield, tail flicking at each exchange, occasionally letting out a short, dismissive breath when a student made what he clearly judged to be an unforced error, and, twice, going very still and quiet, in a way that made Nezu's staff nervous, before relaxing again a moment later. It was the third exchange that made him sit forward. The explosion Quirk boy, cornered by the barrier user in a collapsed stairwell, made a decision that shouldn't have worked on paper. A full-power detonation at point-blank range, using the collapsing structure around them as a blast shield to redirect the force sideways rather than absorbing it head-on. A piece of improvisation that took the barrier user completely off guard and ended the exchange in under 2 seconds. "There," Beerus said, sitting forward, tail going still. "That one." "Bakugo," Nezu supplied. Explosion-type quirk, considerable raw output, still developing tactical restraint to match it. "He didn't wait for the fight to tell him what to do," Beerus said. "He used the environment before his opponent thought to. That's rarer than raw strength." He glanced sideways at Nezu, with something almost like approval. Most creatures with power that large spend years learning to think as fast as they can hit. That one's already most of the way there. Nezu made a small, careful note, the kind he'd analyze in considerably more depth later, and said nothing, letting the observation stand. The match ran its course. A hard-fought, genuinely close result, ending with the explosion team securing the simulated objective by a margin narrow enough that both sides walked off the field looking more exhausted than triumphant. And as the students filed out toward the locker rooms, unaware they'd been graded by an audience considerably more consequential than their instructors, Beerus turned to Nezu with the particular directness of a being who had run out of patience for indirect questions. "You're strongest," he said. "Not the students, the adults, the ones your civilization actually depends on when something serious happens. I want to see one." Nezu considered this for a long moment, weighing the request with visible care. "May I ask why?" "Because," Beerus said, "you've spent the last days showing me children playing at war, and a courtyard full of frightened teachers, and I still don't have an honest measure of what actually stands between this world and something that decides to end it. I want to see what your civilization is actually worth, Nezu. Not what it hopes it's worth." Something in the phrasing, "worth," settled over the gallery with real weight, and Nezu understood, with the particular clarity of a strategist recognizing the actual shape of a negotiation for the first time, that this had never really been a courtesy visit. It was an audit. It had been an audit since the moment Beerus stepped off that rooftop, and everything since, the cafeteria, the pudding, the training match, had all been data toward a verdict Beerus had not yet finished calculating. "There's one hero," Nezu said slowly, "who spent the last several years training specifically because the previous symbol of peace could no longer carry that title alone. He's not yet at the level his predecessor reached, but he's the closest thing this country has to an answer for exactly the kind of question you're asking." He paused. "I'd need to make a call. He's currently on a separate assignment, and I won't summon him into a situation without being honest about what, and who, he's walking into." "Then make the call," Beerus said, settling back against the railing with the satisfied, patient stillness of a king who had just been told his court was, at last, about to become interesting. "I've been remarkably patient today, Nezu. I'd like to see if it was worth it." Beside him, Whis's expression had shifted, the open delight of the last hour giving way, briefly, to something quieter, more watchful, the specific attentiveness of a man who understood, better than anyone else on that platform, exactly how much was riding on whatever happened next. "Beerus," he said, quietly enough that only his companion could hear, "do be fair to them, when he arrives." "Whatever you decide." "I'm always fair," Beerus said. "Whis, who had watched him unmake more than one world across 11 billion years, chose, wisely, not to argue the point aloud, and simply hoped, with the particular hope of someone who had learned exactly how narrow the margin for hope could get, that this world would give Beerus a reason to keep being generous with his patience. Endeavor arrived at UA 40 minutes later, and the temperature on the observation platform seemed to drop the instant he stepped through the gate. Not literally, though it would have been a fair guess given the man's reputation, but in the way a room changes when someone walks into it, already braced for a fight they haven't been told the terms of. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his presence built from decades of being the second strongest man in the country, and knowing it in every fiber of how he carried himself. Flame licking faintly at his beard even at rest. The low, banked heat of a man whose quirk had never fully learned how to be dormant. Nezu had briefed him on the walk-in, as much as anyone could brief a man on the concept of a god in under 5 minutes. And Endeavor had listened with the particular, controlled stillness of someone filing away information he intended to use rather than simply absorb. He stopped at the base of the gallery stairs and looked up at the small purple figure seated on the railing, and something in his expression, not fear, not quite, but a very close cousin of it, the specific recalibration of a man who had spent his entire career believing himself close to the top of a hierarchy, and was now being shown, with no ceremony at all, exactly how far that hierarchy actually extended. "You're the one from the news," Endeavor said. It wasn't a question. "I'm the one who's bored of introducing myself," Beerus said, dropping down from the railing to land, weightless, on the arena floor below. "Nezu tells me you're this world's strongest. I'd like to see that for myself, rather than take his word for it. You want to fight me? I want to see what you're worth," Beerus corrected, tail flicking. "Whether that requires a fight depends entirely on you." Endeavor's jaw tightened, the specific tension of a man who had spent his entire career never backing down from a challenge, and understood, with cold professional clarity, that backing down from this one might be the only intelligent decision available to him, and understood, in the same breath, that it might not matter either way. "If I refuse, then I'll have learned something about you regardless," Beerus said. "Just not the thing I came here to learn." Nezu, watching from the gallery with his paws folded tight enough to show real tension for the first time all day, stepped to the rail. "Beerus, I'd ask you to consider what happens to this country's confidence in its own strongest hero if this ends badly for him in front of witnesses. Whatever verdict you're reaching, I don't think public humiliation needs to be part of the data." Beerus glanced up at him, weighing the request and, to the visible surprise of everyone on the platform, inclined his head. A small, grudging concession. "Fine. Controlled. No collateral beyond this arena. Whis will make sure of that, if I forget myself." He looked back at Endeavor. "Attack me. Full strength. I'll tell you when I've seen enough." Endeavor did not need to be told twice. Whatever fear the situation carried, 3 decades of hero instinct took over, the instant an opponent gave explicit permission to engage, and he moved. Flame erupting along both arms in a controlled, blistering surge, the air around him rippling with heat that had, on record, melted steel, and ended fights before opponents could close distance. He came in fast, a full power blast aimed not to kill but to test, the specific calibrated violence of a man who understood exactly how much force a controlled engagement with an unknown entity could safely carry. The flame reached Beerus and simply stopped mattering. He didn't dodge it. He didn't block it. He stood in the center of it, robes and fur entirely untouched, heat that had scorched concrete and buckled steel in previous incidents rolling off him with less effect than a warm afternoon breeze, and regarded Endeavor through the flame with an expression of open, faint disappointment. "That's it," Beerus said. Endeavor's flame surged higher, real effort behind it now. The controlled edge of his usual restraint giving way to something closer to genuine exertion. And still nothing changed. The heat simply failed to register as a threat, the way a candle fails to warm a furnace. And after several long seconds of sustained, maximum output flame producing no visible effect whatsoever, Endeavor let the fire drop, breathing hard, staring at an opponent who hadn't so much as shifted his stance. "I don't understand," Endeavor said, and it cost him, visibly, to admit it aloud. "You've never fought anything that didn't need to fear your fire," Beerus said. It wasn't cruel exactly. It had the flat, clinical honesty of an assessment, rather than an insult, which somehow made it land harder. "That's not a failing unique to you. It's the natural consequence of being the strongest thing in a small pond for long enough. You stop learning what to do against something the pond never contained." He tilted his head. "Try something else. You have more than fire. I can feel it." Endeavor hesitated, and then, with the grim, focused clarity of a man deciding there was nothing left to lose by trying, shifted his approach entirely. A rapid series of close-range strikes augmented by precise, controlled bursts of propulsion, testing speed, and physical technique rather than raw output, probing for any opening at all in a defense that had, so far, shown him none. Beerus let 3 strikes land, doing nothing at all to stop them, simply standing and absorbing blows that would have shattered a normal building's foundation, and then, almost lazily, caught the 4th strike between 2 fingers. The arena went silent. "Better," Beerus said, and there was, for the first time, something like genuine approval in his voice. That last one had actual thought behind it. You adjusted mid-engagement instead of repeating what wasn't working. Most creatures panic and escalate the same failed strategy louder. You didn't. He released Endeavor's fist, and the hero staggered back half a step, breathing hard, sweat cutting through the soot on his brow. "You're still nowhere close to threatening me. I want to be clear about that, but you're not a fraud either. There's a difference between a strong thing and a serious thing, and you're closer to the second than most of what I've seen on this rock so far." Endeavor straightened, pride and exhaustion warring visibly across his face, and asked the only question that seemed to matter anymore. "What was the point of this?" "I told you," Beerus said, turning away, already losing interest now that the data had been collected. "I wanted to know what this world was worth. Your one data point. Not the deciding one, but not a wasted one either." He looked back up at the gallery, at Nezu, at Whis, at the small knot of teachers who had watched the entire exchange with the specific held breath of people who understood, even without fully grasping the stakes, that something important had just been quietly decided. Your strongest can survive contact with something serious without folding entirely, Beerus said. That tells me more about this planet than the cafeteria did. A pause, tail flicking, barely. He drifted back up toward the gallery, the loose, satisfied ease of a being who had gotten what he came for, and left Endeavor standing alone in the center of the arena, the single strongest hero in the country, breathing hard, staring at his own hands, quietly reckoning with the fact that he had just been measured against something that hadn't even needed to try, and had, in its own strange alien way, called him worth keeping. It was not, Endeavor would reflect much later, the validation he'd spent his career chasing. But it was, in its own terrible way, the first time in years anyone had told him he'd genuinely surprised them, and he wasn't entirely sure yet whether that was a comfort or a warning. Above the arena, unnoticed by everyone except Whis, a second god watched the whole exchange from a rooftop 3 kilometers distant, a lean patchwork figure with hands stuffed deep in tattered pockets, decayed fingers curled loosely at his sides, red eyes narrowed with the first flicker of real, calculating interest he'd shown in months. Shigaraki Tomura had been planning to scout a supply route today. He had found something considerably more interesting instead. The safe house smelled of instant noodles and old cigarette smoke, tucked into the back rooms of a shuttered bar 3 districts from UA, and Shigaraki Tomura had been staring at the same live news feed for 11 straight minutes without saying a word, which, to anyone who'd spent time around him, was itself a kind of alarm bell. "You're doing the thing," Toga said, from where she was perched cross-legged on the bar counter, knife spinning idly between her fingers. "The thing where you go quiet and then something explodes." "Not yet," Shigaraki said, without looking away from the screen. "Rewind it. The training ground footage. Play it again." Twice found already stolen from a commission-adjacent surveillance feed by a contact whose loyalty had so far remained purchasable. The footage was grainy, distant, clearly never meant to leave internal channels, but it was more than enough to show what mattered. A small purple figure standing motionless in the center of a blast of Endeavor's full-output flame, entirely untouched, and then, a moment later, catching the man's fist between 2 fingers like swatting a fly. "That's the thing from the tower," Dabi said, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe with the particular stillness he wore when something genuinely interested him rather than merely amused him. "Erased 30 floors last night. No delay, no residue. Half the underground's already talking about it like it's the second coming of All for One." "It's not like All for One," Shigaraki said, quiet, still watching. "All for One takes things, steals, stockpiles, transfers. There's a mechanism to him, even at his worst. You can hate him, you can study him, you can eventually plan around him, because underneath everything, he's still playing a game with rules." He gestured, decayed fingers twitching, at the frozen frame on the screen. Endeavor's fist held motionless between 2 casual fingers. "That's not playing a game. That's not even acknowledging there's a game being played." "So what is it?" Toga said, tilting her head. "I don't know yet," Shigaraki said. "That's the part I don't like." He straightened, red eyes fixed on the screen with an intensity that had, over the last several weeks of relative quiet, been noticeably absent from most of what he did. Sensei's been talking about legacy, about building something that outlasts him. He's spent his whole existence collecting power, stacking it, refining it into one perfect vessel. A slow, dry breath. What do you do when something walks into your world that doesn't care about any of that? That could erase the entire stockpile he spent decades assembling and never once feel it as an accomplishment worth remembering. Nobody in the room had a good answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. "You want to fight it," Dabi said. Not a question, exactly. More a flat statement testing the shape of the idea aloud. "I want to understand it," Shigaraki said. "Fighting it comes after, if it comes at all. Sensei always said the mistake amateurs make is reaching for a weapon before they understand what they're actually facing. I'm not making that mistake with this one." He turned from the screen, restless energy visible in the way his fingers kept twitching against each other, an old, half-buried tic from a childhood long since paved over by everything he'd become since. "I want eyes on it. Not engagement, not yet. I want to know what it wants, what makes it act, what it actually values. Because something that erased a building for being annoyed and then spent the rest of the day eating lunch and watching children spar isn't operating on instinct. It's operating on some kind of judgment. And judgment," he said, quiet, almost to himself, "can be understood. Judgment can, eventually, be worked with. Or against," Toga offered, cheerful. "Or against," Shigaraki agreed. "Depending what it decides this world is worth." 3 kilometers away, in a rather more comfortable setting entirely unaware it was currently the subject of League surveillance, Whis had drifted off from the post-training debrief to indulge a different curiosity entirely, one that had nothing to do with power levels or combat readiness, and everything to do with the small green-haired quirkless-turned-not-quite-quirkless boy he'd noticed twice now, standing a little too close to conversations he had no business overhearing. He found Izuku Midoriya in a quiet corner of the training grounds equipment shed, ostensibly organizing support gear, actually scribbling furiously in a battered notebook whose margins were, on closer inspection, already dense with theories about erasure-type mechanics that had no basis whatsoever in reality but were, Whis noted with real amusement, constructed with genuine analytical rigor all the same. "You filled 3 pages, Whis observed, settling onto an overturned equipment crate with the easy, weightless grace that made most furniture entirely optional for him. "And every single theory is wrong." Midoriya nearly dropped the notebook. Sorry, I wasn't trying to." "Oh, don't apologize," Whis said, waving a hand. "I find it rather charming. You've built an entire framework, trying to reconcile what you saw yesterday with the rules you already understand. And the fact that it's wrong isn't a failure of intelligence. It's simply that you're working from an incomplete map. You can't derive the shape of the ocean from a puddle, however carefully you study the puddle." Midoriya lowered the notebook slowly, torn between the specific terror of being caught and the far larger, more familiar pull of being handed information nobody else had access to. "Then, could you tell me what it actually is? I don't mean to be rude, I've spent my whole life trying to understand how quirks work, what makes strength, and last night broke every rule I thought I understood, and I can't." He stopped himself, visibly reeling the words back in with effort. "Sorry, I do this. I talk too much when something doesn't make sense to me yet. It's a good habit, in moderation," Whis said, genuinely amused. "Most beings stop asking questions the moment fear tells them to. You haven't, which I think says rather a lot about you." He considered the boy for a moment, weighing how much was wise to share, and settled, as he so often did, on rather more honesty than strict caution recommended. "What Beerus did to that building isn't a power derived from anything native to your world. It doesn't come from a quirk, or training, or an artifact, or anything your framework has language for yet. He is what my world calls a god of destruction, one of several across a rather larger structure of existence than I suspect anyone here has considered possible. His role, put simply, is to maintain balance. Where creation runs unchecked, destruction follows to restore proportion. It is not, strictly, malice. It's function, cosmic maintenance, if you'll forgive the mundane phrase for something considerably larger." Midoriya's pen had stopped moving entirely, notebook forgotten in his lap, eyes wide with the specific, overwhelmed focus of someone whose entire worldview was being quietly rebuilt in real time. "And you? What are you?" "I'm an angel," Whis said. "I attend him. I teach him. Martial technique, mostly. Though I like to think I've broadened his palette over the millennia in other ways as well. I am, in the broadest sense, meant to help keep his judgment measured. Whether he destroys a world or spares it is, ultimately, his decision to make. My role is simply to ensure it's an informed one." He smiled, faintly rueful. "I don't always succeed. He can be remarkably stubborn, for a being who claims to value good judgment above all else." "So he's deciding," Midoriya said slowly, working through it aloud the way he worked through everything. "Whether Earth gets to keep existing. Right now, that's actually happening." "In essence, yes," Whis said, with the gentle, unhurried honesty of someone who had delivered this exact conversation, in one form or another, on a great many worlds before this one. "Though I'd encourage you not to spend too much energy panicking about it. Beerus rarely destroys a world outright without significant provocation. It's simply not worth the effort, and he is, whatever else he is, a being who values his own comfort rather highly. What he's far more likely to do if this world genuinely fails to interest him, is simply leave. Which would, I think, be a rather quieter tragedy than the one you're imagining. A world that never learns how close it came, and never has the chance to become something that might have mattered to him instead. Midoriya absorbed this in silence for a long moment, gears visibly turning behind his eyes, before he asked the question that had, evidently, been sitting underneath everything else since the moment he'd first heard the word Quirk fall flat and meaningless out of Beerus's mouth. What would make this world interesting to him? If it's not power. I mean, Endeavor fought him and he wasn't even really impressed, not really. So it can't just be about strength. No, Whis agreed. It isn't. Power alone bores him rather quickly, actually. He's seen entire universes built on nothing but raw strength, and they tend to be rather predictable places in the end. What interests Beerus, when something manages it, is usually smaller than that. Genuine surprise. A choice he didn't expect. A civilization doing something with its power that a being who's watched a great many civilizations hasn't quite seen before. He tilted his head, studying Midoriya with real, unhurried interest. You, for instance, interested him rather more than you seem to realize. Not because of any power you showed him none at all. Because you looked at something that erased 41 people the night before, and instead of running, you tried to understand it. That's rarer than you'd think, even among beings who consider themselves brave. Midoriya sat with that for a long moment, notebook still open on his lap, and something in his expression shifted, the reflexive terror of the last 24 hours settling, slowly, into something steadier, more purposeful. Then maybe, he said, quiet, working it out as he spoke. The answer isn't showing him how strong we are. Maybe it's showing him what we actually do with the strength we have. Whis smiled. The wide, genuinely delighted smile of a teacher watching a student arrive, entirely on their own, at exactly the conclusion he'd been hoping they'd reach. Now that, he said, is precisely the kind of thinking that keeps worlds standing. The days that followed settled into something the Commission's internal reports began, with grim bureaucratic humor, to call the observation period, a stretch of nearly a week in which Beerus, apparently satisfied that Musutafu was not, for the moment, worth erasing, simply began existing in Japan's hero society, with the casual, unbothered permanence of a natural disaster that had decided to take up residence rather than pass through. He did not stay confined to UA. That would have suited neither his temperament nor his appetite, and within 3 days he had, through a combination of pure curiosity and total disregard for any security protocol the Commission tried to establish, sampled his way through 9 different cities' worth of restaurants, attended, uninvited, unannounced, and to the lasting terror of everyone involved, 2 separate hero agency briefings, simply because Whis had mentioned they sounded administratively interesting, and developed, to the Commission's considerable relief, a genuine, if grudging, fondness for a small family-run confectionery in Hosu, whose owner had no idea her shop's continued existence had, at one point, hinged on the quality of a single dorayaki. Whis, meanwhile, had all but embedded himself in UA's daily operations, drifting between classes with the delighted, tireless curiosity of a scholar who had found, after 11 billion years, a subject genuinely new to him. He sat in on Ectoplasm's combat theory lectures. He asked Powerloader detailed, technically precise questions about support item engineering that left the man simultaneously flattered and faintly unnerved. He spent an entire afternoon in Recovery Girl's office discussing the biological mechanics of quirk factors with the specific, patient thoroughness of a being cataloging something he intended to remember for a very long time. It was on the 6th day, in a quiet corner of the UA library long after most students had gone to the dorms, that Nezu finally found the opening he'd been waiting for. "You've been remarkably generous with your time this week," Nezu said, settling into the seat across from Whis with 2 cups of tea he'd prepared himself, sliding one across the table with the easy, deliberate hospitality of a host who understood exactly how much diplomacy could be accomplished over something as small as a shared drink. "I confess, I'd expected you and Beerus to have grown bored of us by now." "Beerus grows bored quickly of things that stop surprising him," Whis said, accepting the tea with genuine pleasure. "You, Principal Nezu, have managed to avoid that rather impressively. I don't believe he's had a single conversation with you yet that went the way he expected." "That's rather the goal," Nezu admitted. "Though I confess I'm curious about something. If you'll indulge me, may I ask, how does this typically go on the other worlds, the ones he's found interesting enough to spare, and the ones he hasn't?" Whis considered the question with real, unhurried thought, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "It varies more than you'd expect," he said. "Some worlds earn his interest through raw spectacle, a civilization doing something genuinely unprecedented with power, something that surprises even a being who's seen a great many things. Others earn it more quietly, through character. Beerus, whatever else he is, has always had a particular, if inconsistent, respect for beings who choose to be better than their circumstances require them to be." He paused. "And some worlds, I'm sorry to say, simply fail to hold his attention long enough to matter either way. Those are, in some respects, the saddest outcomes. Not destroyed in judgment, simply forgotten, left behind because nothing about them was ever interesting enough to be remembered." Nezu absorbed this with the particular stillness of a strategist recalculating the actual shape of the threat his world faced. Not annihilation by force, but something closer to erasure by indifference. A fate that required no violence at all, simply a god who packed up his curiosity and left, and a planet that would never quite understand how close it had come to something else entirely. "And where do you think we currently sit?" Nezu asked. "On that spectrum?" "Honestly," Whis smiled, faint and genuine. "Better than most at this stage. He's stayed longer than his patience usually allows for a world this unremarkable in raw power." He asked twice, unprompted, about a quirkless boy who wasn't even meant to be part of the conversation. He conceded, grudgingly, but genuinely, that your strongest hero was not a fraud. Those are not small things, coming from Beerus. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I let you believe the matter was settled. He hasn't decided yet, and I've learned, across a great many centuries, that the worst thing anyone can do around Beerus is mistake his patience for a promise. "Then what would you suggest?" Nezu asked, direct in the way only a strategist facing existential stakes could afford to be. "If you were advising me, what does this world need to show him that it hasn't yet?" Whis was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with genuine care, rather than offering an easy, comfortable answer. "I think," he said slowly, "you've shown him strength, and he's found it middling but not contemptible. You've shown him structure, your hero system, your training, your civic architecture, and he finds it, in his own dry way, more thoughtfully built than he expected. What you haven't shown him yet is choice. Real choice, under real pressure, where the outcome isn't obvious and the cost is genuine." He looked up, meeting Nezu's eyes with unusual seriousness for a being whose default expression rarely strayed from pleasant curiosity. "Beerus doesn't spare worlds because they're strong, Principal Nezu. He spares them, when he spares them at all, because somewhere in their story they show him something choosing to matter, at real cost, when it would have been easier not to. If this world has that story in it, and I suspect it does, most worlds do, somewhere, you'll want it to happen where he can see it, sooner rather than later." The words settled over the quiet library table with real weight, and Nezu, turning his own cooling tea slowly in his paws, felt the particular, cold clarity of a strategist understanding, at last, that the true test hadn't been the tower, or the training match, or even Endeavor's fight in the arena. The true test hadn't happened yet. And somewhere out there, in a city that had spent the last 6 days quietly, nervously adjusting to the presence of a god who might, at any moment, decide it wasn't worth the trouble, the true test was already, unknowingly, being assembled by forces that had nothing at all to do with Nezu's careful diplomacy, and everything to do with a decayed, red-eyed man who had spent the last week watching, waiting, and beginning, very quietly, to plan. Shigaraki had spent 6 days doing something he rarely did, waiting on purpose, patiently, with a discipline that would have surprised anyone who'd only known him through his early, reckless years. He had watched the surveillance feeds. He had listened to every scrap of underground chatter about the purple god and his floating attendant. He had, more than once, caught himself thinking in Sensei's old cadence: understand before you act, control what you can, and never mistake spectacle for strength, and hated how useful the advice still was, even now, even with Sensei's condition worsening by the week, in whatever hidden facility All for One's remaining loyalists had tucked him away in. He had reached a conclusion, over those 6 days, that the rest of the League found genuinely unsettling in its restraint. "We're not fighting it," he said, laying it out to the assembled remnants of the League in the back room of the safe house. Toga, Dabi, twice his old notes, still pinned to a corkboard nobody had taken down, Spinner quiet in the corner, with his arms crossed. "Not directly, not yet, maybe not ever. I haven't ruled it out, but I'm not stupid enough to open with it as a plan." "Then what," Dabi said, "was the point of a week of surveillance?" "The point," Shigaraki said, "is that this thing doesn't care about power the way everyone assumes it does. It watched Endeavor throw everything he had, and looked bored. It's not here evaluating who can hit hardest. It's evaluating something else, whether this world is worth its attention at all. Worth sparing." He tapped a finger against the corkboard, where a printout of the tower footage still hung, curling slightly at the edges, which means the heroes have already started playing to that. Nezu's been parading it around campus for a week, showing off students, showing off Endeavor, trying to make Japan look impressive. Good for them. But there's another side of this story, nobody's shown it yet. "Us," Toga said, delighted, already seeing where this was going. "Us," Shigaraki confirmed. "Everything the heroes have shown this thing so far has been curated, controlled, polished. It's seen a training exercise, a cafeteria, a fist fight it let happen on its own terms. It hasn't seen what this world actually is underneath the mask the hero system paints over everything, the parts nobody puts in a brochure. If this thing is judging whether this world deserves to keep existing, I want it judging the whole picture, not just the pretty half Nezu's been feeding it." "And you think showing it the ugly half helps us how, exactly?" Spinner said, quiet, skeptical. "Feels like handing the executioner a reason to swing." "Maybe," Shigaraki admitted, unbothered. "Or maybe it respects honesty more than performance. It already showed as much. It liked Endeavor better once the man stopped performing strength and started actually thinking under pressure. I don't know what it wants. Nobody does. But I know what I don't want, and that's a decision about this world's future getting made entirely on the hero's terms, in the hero's curated little garden, without a single voice from the rest of us in the room." His red eyes tracked toward Dabi, then Toga, then Spinner, weighing something none of them could quite name. "This isn't about beating it. It's about being seen. Whatever verdict it reaches, I want it to reach that verdict, having actually looked at all of us, not just the polished half wearing a hero license." It was, everyone in the room understood without needing it said aloud, the single most careful, calculated thing Shigaraki Tamura had proposed, in longer than any of them could remember. And it worried Dobby more than any reckless plan ever had, precisely because it sounded, for the first time in years, like a man who was actually thinking 3 moves ahead, instead of 1 violent step at a time. The opportunity arrived 4 days later, and not by Shigaraki's design at all, which was, in its own way, the most dangerous kind of opportunity, the sort that punished careful plans by simply refusing to wait for them. Beerus, restless after a week and a half of confinement to what he'd started calling, with increasing irritation, the polite version of this planet, had wandered, alone, without Whis, who was occupied cross-referencing support item schematics with Powerloader 3 prefectures away, into a lower-income district on Musutafu's eastern edge, drawn by nothing more sophisticated than the smell of street food, and a low, simmering curiosity about what this world looked like when nobody had time to prepare a performance for him. What he found instead was a robbery in progress, small-scale, almost pathetically minor by the standards of a week that had included a symbol of peace candidate testing his full output against him, a local villain with a knife-based quirk holding up a cramped convenience store, an elderly shopkeeper backed against the register with hands raised, a single terrified customer frozen near the door. It would have taken any competent pro-hero under 30 seconds to resolve. No hero arrived. This was not, evidently, a district that rated fast response times. Beerus watched from across the street with the flat, assessing patience of a being conducting an experiment he hadn't planned to run. Curious, genuinely, coldly curious, what this world did with its cracks when nobody important was watching them. The villain noticed him first, a lean man with restless eyes and a switchblade quirk running along both forearms, jumpy in the particular way of someone whose crimes had, so far, always gone unnoticed by anyone who mattered, and made the catastrophic mistake of assuming a small purple bystander was simply another civilian to threaten into silence. "The hell are you looking at?" the villain snapped, blade extending an extra 6 inches from his knuckles in a display meant to intimidate. "Walk away, or you're next." Beerus tilted his head, genuinely, honestly interested for the first time in several hours. "You're threatening me." "I said walk away." "No," Beerus said, almost gently. "I don't think I will. I think I'd like to see what happens next. Consider this an experiment, small creature. You've caught my attention at a very particular moment, and I find I'm curious whether anyone on this rock is coming to stop you, or whether this is simply how things go, down here, where nobody's built a stage for it." It was, in retrospect, the single most dangerous sentence anyone had spoken to a cornered, frightened villain in that man's entire criminal career, because Beerus did not intervene. He did not raise a finger. He simply watched, arms folded, tail flicking with detached, clinical patience, as the villain's nerve finally broke, and he lunged for the shopkeeper with the blade extended in full, panicked earnest. And it was only the sudden, blistering arrival of a lean figure in a red-white costume, dropping from a fire escape with a speed that belonged to someone who'd trained specifically for exactly this kind of low-profile, unglamorous emergency, that put the villain on the ground before the blade found its mark. Kamui Woods again, off official duty, patrolling a district he'd adopted years ago precisely because nobody else prioritized it. Wooden restraints already binding the villain's wrists before the man had finished hitting the pavement, looked up from the resolved scene and found himself staring, for the second time in 2 weeks, directly into the unreadable, evaluating eyes of a god of destruction. "You were watching," Kamui Woods said, breathing hard, adrenaline still sharp in his voice. "You could have stopped it, instantly. You didn't." "No," Beerus agreed. "I wanted to see who would." "That's..." Kamui Woods bit back the anger rising in his throat, understanding, even furious, exactly how little good shouting at a god would accomplish. "That's a person's life you were treating like an experiment." "Everything is an experiment to something old enough," Beerus said, without apology, though something in his tone had shifted, subtly, into genuine consideration rather than pure detachment. You came. Nobody sent you. No cameras were watching this street. No rankings were being tallied. No audience was here to reward you for it. He studied the young hero for a long moment, tail going still. Why? Kamui Woods straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and answered without hesitation, the exhaustion in his voice giving way to something steadier. Because that's the job, not the cameras, not the rankings. The job's what you do when nobody's watching and it still needs doing. He gestured at the bound villain, the shaken shopkeeper being helped to a chair by the equally shaken customer. You want to judge this world by what it does when the stage is set for it? Fine. But you should know, most of what actually holds it together happens exactly like this. Small. Unwitnessed. Nobody keeping score. Beerus said nothing for a long moment, tail flicking once, twice, processing something that sat, visibly, a little differently than anything he'd been shown in the carefully curated week prior, and it was in that exact silence, from a rooftop 2 blocks distant, that Shigaraki Tamura watched the entire unplanned encounter unfold through a stolen pair of long-range binoculars, and understood, with a slow, cold clarity, that the universe had just handed him something considerably more useful than anything he could have staged himself. It watches when nobody's performing, he thought. It watches what people are, not what they show it. That, more than any plan he'd spent the last 10 days assembling, was the single most important thing he'd learned about the god currently deciding his world's fate. And he intended, very soon, to make absolutely certain it saw exactly what the League of Villains actually was, unpolished and unhidden, before anyone else got to decide what that verdict should look like. Shigaraki made contact 8 days later, and he did it in a way that surprised everyone who thought they understood how he operated. Not with violence, not with a staged catastrophe designed to force Beerus's attention, but with something almost absurdly simple. He walked, alone, unarmed by any obvious measure, into the small confectionery in Hosu where Beerus had, by now, become something between a regular customer and a minor local legend, and sat down at the table across from him. Whis, present as always, went very still, staff angled fractionally, the easy warmth in his expression cooling into something far more watchful. Beerus did not look up from his dorayaki immediately. "You've been following me for 11 days, he said, around a mouthful. "I noticed on day 3. I let it continue because I was curious how long it would take you to actually speak to me, instead of hiding on rooftops like something that hadn't decided if it was brave yet." Shigaraki's jaw tightened, the small flicker of a man who prided himself on control being reminded, casually, that he'd been transparent the entire time. "I wasn't hiding. I was deciding whether talking to you was worth the risk, and now you've decided it is." "Now I've decided," Shigaraki said, "that you're going to make a decision about this world whether I talk to you or not, and I'd rather that decision get made with the full picture instead of whatever curated tour the heroes have been feeding you." He gestured, decayed fingers loose at his sides, at nothing and everything. "You've seen their best, their showcase students, their strongest hero, their principal serving you tea and diplomacy. You haven't seen why people like me exist, what this system actually costs the people it doesn't have a category for." Beerus set down his dorayaki, giving the young man his full, undivided attention for the first time, and Whis, watching closely, recognized in his companion's posture the specific, dangerous stillness of a being who had just decided a conversation was worth having in full. "Then tell me," Beerus said. "I'm listening. I find I've grown tired of being told what this world is by people whose entire livelihood depends on me believing it's worth saving." So Shigaraki told him. He told him about a childhood he rarely spoke of even to Toga or Dabi, a quirk that had, from the moment it first manifested, decayed everything he touched without his control. A family that responded not with patience or training, but with fear and violence. A system of heroes who arrived, eventually, not to save a frightened child but to process a crime scene after the fact. Too late, too structured, too bound by jurisdiction and protocol, to have ever actually prevented what happened. He told him about a world that built entire industries around ranking who deserved rescue and who didn't. About a license system that made it a literal, prosecutable crime to save a life without government-sanctioned permission. About the specific, quiet cruelty of a society that called itself heroic, while leaving its cracks. The districts nobody patrolled quickly. The Quirks nobody knew how to accommodate. The children nobody caught in time. Entirely unaddressed because addressing them wasn't profitable, wasn't photogenic, wasn't part of the performance. He did not ask for sympathy. He stated it plainly, coldly. The way a man recites facts he's long since stopped expecting anyone to be moved by. "I'm not telling you this because I want you to feel sorry for me," Shigaraki said when he'd finished. "I'm telling you because you asked what this world is worth. And I don't think you can answer that honestly without knowing it built its heroism on top of people it failed first. That's not an accident of the system. That's the foundation of it." Beerus was quiet for a long moment, tail curled still around the base of his seat. And when he finally spoke, it was without the flat, judgmental certainty he'd carried through most of the last 2 weeks. "You're not wrong," he said. "I've seen the pattern before. On other worlds, systems that reward the visible and abandon the invisible, then call the arrangement virtue because it's dressed nicely." He studied Shigaraki with something that had shifted, subtly, from evaluation into genuine, difficult consideration. "But I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, not a performance of your own." His eyes narrowed slightly. "What have you built, in the years since that failure, that's better than what failed you? Or have you simply decided that because the world broke you first, breaking it back is the only response worth having?" The question landed harder than Shigaraki had expected, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind his red eyes that wasn't quite anger. "I don't know yet," he admitted, and it clearly cost him to say it aloud. "I know what I'm against. I haven't fully worked out what I'm for." "That," Beerus said, "is the most honest thing anyone on this rock has said to me since I arrived." He picked his dorayaki back up, considering it, considering the young man across from him, weighing something that had grown considerably more complicated than a simple audit of strength and civic architecture. "I'm not going to destroy your world for its failures, small creature. Every world has them. I've yet to find one that doesn't." A pause, tail flicking. "But I'm also not going to pretend your failures excuse whatever you intend to do about them. You've shown me the wound. You haven't shown me its healing into something worth respecting, rather than something that just wants to bleed on everyone else in turn." He stood, leaving payment on the table with the same casual indifference he'd shown every establishment he'd visited that week, and looked down at Shigaraki with an expression that was, for the first time, neither dismissive nor purely evaluative. Something closer, Whis thought, watching carefully, to genuine, difficult uncertainty. "I'll remember what you told me," Beerus said. "Understand that remembering it doesn't mean I've decided it changes my answer. It means I intend to watch what you do with it more closely than I was already planning to." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back with something almost gentle in his voice. "For what it's worth, the boy at the school. Green hair. He asked me what I was, instead of assuming he already knew. You might try that, sometime. Asking, instead of assuming you've already been told the whole answer by your own anger." He left. Whis lingered a moment longer, studying Shigaraki with quiet, searching eyes. "He doesn't often say that much," Whis said gently. "Consider it a rarer gift than you probably realize." Then he too was gone, leaving Shigaraki alone at the table, Decayed fingers curled loosely against the wood, turning over a conversation that had not gone at all the way he'd planned, and had, despite that, or perhaps because of it, shifted something in him he did not yet have words for. News of the encounter reached the commission within the hour, relayed by a nervous informant who'd witnessed the exchange from across the street, and had no idea what to make of a scene that read, on its surface, like nothing so much as two very dangerous people simply talking. Nezu, briefed in his office that evening, listened to the full account with his paws steepled, ears pressed flat in the specific stillness of a strategist recalculating an already complicated equation. He let Shigaraki speak to him, Nezu said slowly, and he didn't retaliate for what was said. He didn't destroy him for what he represents. He simply listened. "What does that mean for us?" Aizawa asked, standing at the window, exhaustion etched deep into every line of his face after 2 weeks that had aged him considerably more than 2 weeks should. "It means," Nezu said, quiet, "that the verdict we've spent 2 weeks trying to shape isn't being built solely on what we choose to show him anymore. It's being built on the whole truth of what this country actually is, its heroism, and its failures both, and I'm not certain, any longer, which half is going to weigh heavier in the end." Outside, the city carried on beneath a sky that had, for 2 weeks now, held a god who had not yet decided whether it deserved to keep existing. And somewhere in that same sky, unbeknownst to any of them, the true test Whis had warned Nezu was still waiting to happen was, at last, beginning to take shape. The crisis, when it came, did not come from Shigaraki. That was, in its own bitter way, the tragedy of it, because for the first time in longer than anyone in the league could remember, Shigaraki Tomura had actually been exercising restraint, holding the rest of them back with a discipline that unsettled even Dabi, waiting to see what patience might earn where violence never had. It came from Toga. Not from malice, not exactly. Toga rarely operated on malice in any form the Commission's psych profiles fully captured, but from a restless, escalating frustration that had been building for 2 weeks while she watched Shigaraki grow cautious, watched the League's momentum bleed away into careful conversations and diplomatic waiting games that felt, to her, like everyone forgetting what they'd actually signed up for. She wanted to see something happen. She wanted proof that any of this mattered, that the god everyone kept tiptoeing around was real, in a way that could be tested rather than simply theorized about over surveillance footage. So she found a target of her own, a minor pro-hero, mid-tier, well-liked, unremarkable in every way, except that she happened to be walking home alone through a quiet residential street, 2 blocks from where Beerus, restless again after another long day of Whis's academic curiosity, had settled to watch the evening traffic with idle, half-formed boredom. Toga did not intend to kill her. She would say so, later, with the particular unsettling sincerity that made her so hard for anyone to fully categorize. She'd only meant to draw blood, to transform, to create a small, contained spectacle close enough to Beerus's attention that he'd have to notice, have to react, have to prove, one way or another, what kind of god this world was actually dealing with. It went wrong in the way reckless plans built on incomplete information always eventually go wrong. The hero fought back harder than expected. Toga's blade found more than a shallow cut. And within 90 seconds of a plan that had never been sanctioned, never been discussed with Shigaraki, never been anything more than one impulsive woman's need to force the universe's hand, a mid-tier pro-hero lay bleeding out on a quiet residential street, and Beerus, drawn by the sudden, sharp spike of violence 2 blocks from where he'd been sitting, arrived to find the entire scene already collapsing toward its worst possible outcome. Toga froze, blade still slick, staring up at a god she had wanted, desperately, to impress, and finding instead an expression on his face that made every instinct in her body scream to run. "You did this," Beerus said, quiet. To get my attention. Toga started, and found, for once in her life, that she had no clever answer ready. Beerus did not destroy her. That was, itself, the thing nobody in that alley expected. Not Toga, frozen and pale. Not Kamui Woods, arriving 40 seconds later to a scene already half resolved by a presence considerably more dangerous than himself. Not the small, gathering crowd of onlookers who'd have sworn, afterward, that they'd watched a god decide, in real time, not to end a life he had every apparent right to end. Instead, Beerus knelt beside the bleeding hero, a woman named Ryuko Tatsuma, whose quirk let her manipulate localized water pressure, entirely useless in the desperate seconds after her own blood had left her body faster than her power could ever hope to replace it, and studied the wound with the flat, clinical attention of a being who had, across 11 billion years, seen every possible way a mortal body could fail. "She'll die in under 4 minutes without intervention," Beerus said, to no one in particular, though Whis, arriving in the same instant with the specific urgency he reserved for genuine emergencies, understood exactly who the observation was actually meant for. "Beerus," Whis said, quiet, careful. "This is the moment I mentioned, the one that matters more than any of the others." Beerus looked down at the dying woman, then up at Toga, still frozen, still pale, still trapped somewhere between terror and the desperate hope that this, finally, had been worth doing, and something in his expression shifted into a stillness Whis recognized from exactly 2 prior worlds across 11 billion years. The specific weight of a god, actually deciding, in real time, rather than simply observing. "I could save her," Beerus said, slowly, half to himself. "It would cost me nothing. A god doesn't need to weigh the effort." His tail flicked, once, sharp. "But I want to be clear about what I'm actually choosing, before I choose it. If I save her, I'm not simply healing a wound. I'm telling every creature on this rock that consequences can be erased, the same way buildings can. That recklessness gets rescued by a passing god, so long as the god happens to be nearby, and in the mood. That's not justice. That's a different kind of corruption, dressed up as mercy. And if you don't," Whis said gently, "a woman who did nothing to deserve this, dies in an alley, because someone else wanted your attention badly enough to spend her life buying it." The alley held its breath, Kamui Woods frozen mid-approach, uncertain whether intervening himself would help or catastrophically complicate whatever was unfolding. Toga, still unable to move, watching a god weigh her victim's life on a scale she hadn't understood existed until this exact moment. And somewhere at the edge of the gathering crowd, arriving 3 minutes too late to have prevented any of it, Shigaraki Tomura, who had sprinted the last 4 blocks the instant he'd heard where Toga had gone, and now stood frozen at the mouth of the alley, watching the single worst outcome of 2 weeks of careful restraint unfold, in real time, in front of the one being whose judgment actually mattered. Beerus made his decision the way he made most decisions, quickly, once he'd actually decided. Without further hesitation once the weighing was done, he pressed 2 fingers lightly to Ryuko Tatsuma's chest, and the wound closed, not erased, not undone as though it had never happened, but healed, in the specific, deliberate way of a being choosing to intervene, rather than simply reversing a mistake out of existence. She gasped, color returning to her face in a slow, visible rush, alive and breathing and, very clearly, going to survive. Then Beerus turned to Toga, and the warmth he'd shown the dying woman evaporated entirely. "I saved her," he said, "because letting her die to teach the rest of you a lesson would have made me exactly the kind of god that gives judgment a bad name. That was my choice, and I stand by it." His eyes, fixed on Toga now, went very cold. "But understand this clearly, small creature, because I will not repeat myself. You did not earn my attention today. You spent a life you had no right to spend, gambling that I would clean up the consequences. And you were correct. But only because she deserved better than to die for your impatience. Not because you deserved anything at all. His tail lashed once, sharp. If you ever do something like this again, if you ever again decide that a life is a currency worth spending to buy my notice, I will not be nearly so generous with what I choose to save. Toga, for the first time in longer than anyone present could recall, said nothing at all. Shigaraki reached her a moment later, pulling her back from the scene with a grip that was rougher than usual, his own face carrying an expression somewhere between fury and something that looked, disturbingly, like fear, not of Beerus, but of what Toga's recklessness had just cost the League in a currency far more valuable than any single life. The fragile, carefully built credibility he'd spent 2 weeks constructing, one honest conversation at a time. "We're leaving," Shigaraki said, low, to Toga, to Dabi, to the 2 other League members who'd arrived in the chaos. Now, they vanished into the city's evening shadows within the minute, leaving behind a healed hero, a shaken crowd, and a god who stood in the center of it all, with an expression that Whis, watching closely, recognized as something rarer than judgment. It was, unmistakably, disappointment. The specific, weary disappointment of a being who had, for one brief conversation over dorayaki, allowed himself to believe a broken thing might be building toward something better, and had just watched that belief cost someone almost everything. "Beerus," Whis said, quietly, once the alley had begun to empty, ambulances arriving at last to a patient who no longer needed them nearly as urgently as they'd been told. "That was, I think, the hardest choice anyone on this world has asked of you since we arrived." "It shouldn't have been a choice at all," Beerus said, and for the first time since landing on this planet, there was something in his voice that sounded, unmistakably, tired. "A world that works properly doesn't need a passing god to decide, in an alley, whether a woman lives or dies, because someone else wanted to prove a point." He looked up at the darkening sky, tail still, and Whis understood, watching him, that whatever verdict Beerus had been quietly assembling over the last 2 weeks had just shifted, in this single alley, more than anything that had come before it. "I'm close to a decision," Beerus said finally. "I want to see how the rest of this plays out first, but I'm close." The fallout from the alley reached the commission within the hour, and it reached UA not long after, carried by Aizawa, in a debrief that left Nezu uncharacteristically silent for a long stretch after the report concluded. "He saved her," Nezu said finally, turning the information over with visible care. Despite every reason his own philosophy might have given him not to, and told the League, in the same breath, that he wouldn't be so generous again, Tsukauchi added, standing at the office window with the particular stillness of a man who'd spent the afternoon reviewing footage he wished he hadn't had to watch. "That's not mercy without conditions, Nezu. That's a warning wearing mercy's clothes." "Perhaps," Nezu said, "or perhaps it's the most honest thing he's shown us yet, that his judgment isn't fixed, that it moves, that a single choice made under real pressure can shift the entire calculation more than 2 weeks of curated hospitality ever could." He was quiet a moment, ears low, working through something with the particular focus of a strategist who understood, at last, that the game had changed shape beneath him. He told Whis he was close to a decision. That means whatever happens next isn't background anymore. It's the test. "Then what do we do?" Aizawa asked, flat, exhausted in the specific way of a man who had spent 2 weeks holding a country's fate at arm's length, and was no longer certain his arms could hold much longer. "We don't perform for him," Nezu said, slowly, the shape of it clarifying even as he spoke it aloud. "That's what I got wrong, I think, from the very first day. I built a tour, a showcase, cafeteria, training grounds, our strongest hero on his best behavior, all of it curated, all of it aimed at proving something, and Beerus saw through every layer of it within the first afternoon. He told me so himself, more or less, when he asked to see something raw instead of rehearsed. He straightened, small paws folding with renewed resolve. So we stop performing. Whatever happens next, we let him see it as it actually is, not staged for his approval, not softened for his judgment. If this world is going to be judged, let it be judged honestly, on its own terms, rather than on how well we manage to dress it up for an audience of one. It was. Everyone in the room understood, both the most obvious conclusion and the hardest one to actually live by. Because a country's entire hero infrastructure had spent decades learning to perform competence and control for exactly the kind of crisis this had become, and unlearning that instinct, now, with the stakes this high, would require something closer to faith than strategy. They did not have long to wait for the opportunity to prove it. It came 4 days later, and it came, fittingly, from a direction nobody in the Commission's careful planning had accounted for. Not from Beerus, not from the League, but from the Meta-Liberation Army's remnants, a splinter faction operating in the shadows since Redestro's fall, small in number now but no less fanatical, who had spent the last 2 weeks watching the same footage everyone else had, and had reached a conclusion entirely their own. If a god had arrived to judge whether this world's power structures deserved to continue, they reasoned, then the surest way to earn a favorable verdict was to demonstrate, decisively and publicly, exactly the kind of world their ideology promised. A world where the strong ruled openly, unapologetically, without the hypocritical mask of licensed heroism pretending restraint it never actually practiced. They staged their demonstration in the middle of Musutafu's central business district at the height of the afternoon rush. A coordinated show of raw destructive force meant less to conquer anything than to perform, loudly and unmistakably, for an audience they were certain was watching. It worked, in the narrowest, most literal sense. Beerus noticed within minutes the sudden, chaotic spike of violence impossible to ignore, even for a being who'd spent the last 2 weeks growing steadily less interested in raw spectacle. He arrived over the district with Whis a heartbeat behind him, and found a scene that was, in its own way, a grotesque mirror of everything Nezu had spent 2 weeks trying to show him. Pro-heroes scrambling to contain a coordinated assault, civilians fleeing through streets suddenly turned to rubble, and at the center of it, a cluster of Meta-Liberation Army remnants unleashing raw, unrestrained power with the specific, performative intensity of people who believed, sincerely, that a god was watching and needed to be impressed by strength alone. Beerus watched for exactly 11 seconds before his expression settled into something colder than anything he'd shown since the tower. "They think this is for me," he said, quiet, to Whis. "I believe so, yes," Whis said, grim. "That's insulting," Beerus said, and the temperature of the moment shifted, sharp and sudden, in a way that made every hero on the ground below feel it, before they understood why. Do they imagine I've spent 2 weeks watching this world, learning its shape, sitting through cafeteria lunches and combat theory lectures, and a very long conversation about a boy's tragic childhood, only to be won over by a handful of small creatures breaking things loudly in a shopping district? That's not strength. That's theater performed for an audience that already told them, explicitly, it finds theater boring. He descended toward the district not with the detached, evaluative calm of the last 2 weeks, but with something sharper, genuine, focused anger, the specific fury of a being who had, despite every instinct telling him not to invest in a world this small and this new, begun to care what happened to it, and now found that care being mistaken for a prize to be won through cheap spectacle, rather than something that had actually been earned through 2 weeks of difficult, honest engagement. What followed was not a fight, in any sense the Meta-Liberation Army remnants had planned for. It was closer to a correction, Swift, absolute, and delivered with a precision that left every structure the group had damaged standing again within minutes. Every civilian who'd been caught in the chaos unharmed, and every attacker restrained, disarmed, and utterly unable to explain afterward exactly what had happened to them. In the handful of seconds it had taken a god to decide their demonstration had failed spectacularly at its only goal. Pro-heroes arriving on scene minutes later found a district already stabilized, attackers already bound, and a god standing in the center of it with an expression that made even the Commission's most seasoned field agents keep a respectful, careful distance. It was Kamui Woods, again, present again by nothing more than the persistent coincidence of a young hero who kept finding himself at the exact center of this god's education, who approached first, careful, uncertain what he'd find. "You saved the district," he said, cautious. "You didn't have to." "No," Beerus agreed, tail still lashing with residual, unspent anger. "I didn't. I did it because leaving it to burn would have punished people who had nothing to do with the stupidity that started it. And I've apparently decided, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, that I care whether that happens or not." He looked at Kamui Woods directly, something almost rueful in his expression. "That's rather inconvenient, if I'm honest. Caring makes decisions considerably more complicated than not caring ever did." Kamui Woods, despite 2 weeks of learning to expect nothing predictable from this particular god, found himself genuinely surprised by the admission. "Is that a bad thing? Caring? I don't know yet," Beerus said, honestly, tail finally stilling. "Ask me again once I've decided what to do about it." Above them, watching from a rooftop with Whis at his side, the angel allowed himself, for the first time in 2 weeks, something that looked almost like real hope. "He said he cares," Whis murmured, mostly to himself. Beerus rarely says that about anything, let alone a world barely 2 weeks into an acquaintance. He glanced sideways, thoughtful. "I believe we may be closer to an answer than either of us expected." The decision came 3 days later, and it came, in the end, not from a spectacle at all. No fight, no rescue, no test staged by anyone, hero or villain or splinter faction hungry for a verdict. It came from an ordinary Tuesday morning that Beerus, for reasons he did not fully explain even to Whis, chose to spend at UA, sitting on the same rooftop railing where he'd first surveyed Musutafu 2.5 weeks earlier, watching the campus below with the particular, settled stillness of a being who had run out of new things to test and had, finally, arrived at the edge of his own patience for waiting. Nezu found him there shortly after sunrise, climbing the stairs alone, without escort, without prepared remarks, understanding, with the particular clarity that comes to a strategist at the end of a long campaign, that whatever happened this morning would happen on Beerus's terms, and that the only honest thing left to offer was his presence, rather than another argument. "You're not performing today," Beerus observed, without turning. "No," Nezu said, settling onto the railing a respectful distance away. "I ran out of performances 2 weeks ago, if I'm honest. Everything since has just been us, trying to survive being seen clearly. That's the only version of you that's ever actually interested me," Beerus said. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the campus stir to life below. Students crossing the courtyard toward morning classes, the distant hum of Ground Beta's training grounds already active, the ordinary, unremarkable rhythm of a civilization that had spent 2.5 weeks learning to function under the weight of a god's undecided judgment, and had, somehow, kept functioning anyway. "I've seen a great many worlds, Nezu. More than I could count, if I tried. Most of them show me exactly one thing, clearly, and I make my decision on that basis, because that's all they ever offer. Strength, or fragility, or cruelty, or a kind of hollow, performed goodness that collapses the moment nobody's rewarding it." "And what has this one shown you?" Nezu asked, quiet. All of it, Beerus said. Strength that wasn't fraud, in your fire user. Fragility real enough that I nearly let it teach a cruel lesson before I decided against it. Cruelty dressed as ideology, performing for an audience that had already told it, plainly, that performance bored it. And beneath all of that, a boy who asked what I was instead of assuming he already knew. A hero who came running to a robbery nobody was watching, because the job doesn't require an audience to matter. A broken thing, he added, more quietly, who told me the truth about his own wound instead of hiding it, and hasn't yet decided what he's going to build from it, but is, I think, further along that road than he was 3 weeks ago. Nezu said nothing, understanding, with the particular restraint of a man who had learned exactly when silence served better than argument, that Beerus was not finished. I don't destroy worlds because they're imperfect, Beerus said, finally. If I did, I'd have run out of worlds a long time ago. I destroy them when they're not worth the effort of watching, when nothing in them surprises me, or moves me, or makes me wonder what they'll do next. This one has done that more times in 2.5 weeks than most manage in a century. He turned, at last, to look at Nezu directly, and something in his expression had settled into a stillness that Whis, arriving quietly a moment later, recognized immediately as the specific calm of a decision already made. I'm not going to destroy this world, Nezu. I want to be clear that's not because it's earned some perfect score on whatever ledger you imagined I was keeping. It's because it's shown me, over and over, that it's still becoming something. And I find, against every instinct that usually governs these decisions, that I'd rather see what it becomes than end the story before it gets there. Nezu closed his eyes for a long moment. The enormous, quiet weight of 2.5 weeks, finally, genuinely lifting, and when he spoke again, his voice was steadier than it had any right to be. Thank you, he said, simply. Not for sparing us, though I am, obviously, profoundly grateful for that. Thank you for actually looking. Most beings with your power wouldn't have bothered. Most beings with my power get bored before they finish looking, Beerus said, something almost fond entering his tone. You should be grateful I found this rock interesting enough to stay patient. That's rarer than the sparing itself. Whis, settling beside them with quiet, genuine warmth, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. I did tell you, dear, this world had something worth seeing. You tell me that about every world, Beerus said. You were right this time. Try not to let it go to your head. Below them, entirely unaware that the fate of their entire civilization had just been quietly, finally decided on a rooftop over morning tea, UA's campus continued its ordinary morning rhythm, students hurrying to class, a training exercise beginning in the distance, the small, unremarkable persistence of a world that had, without ever fully realizing how close it had come, just been given the chance to keep becoming whatever it was going to become. Word of the decision moved through the Commission's channels within the hour, and from there through hero agencies, through UA's staff, through the careful, controlled press releases that would eventually, days later, in heavily sanitized form, reach the public at large. The details of the decision itself, the full weight of what Beerus had actually weighed and why, would remain classified, understood fully, only by the small handful of people who'd stood closest to it. Nezu, Aizawa, Tsukauchi, a green-haired boy who'd asked the right question at exactly the right moment, and a young hero named Kamui Woods, who would spend the rest of his career quietly, privately proud of a robbery response nobody had ever meant to matter this much. But the city itself seemed to feel it. In the particular, wordless way cities sometimes register the passing of something enormous. A held breath finally released. A tension in the air that had settled over Musutafu for 2.5 weeks, quietly, gradually dissolving into something closer to ordinary life resuming. Beerus and Whis did not leave immediately. There was, Whis noted privately to Nezu, no particular urgency to it now that the verdict was settled. Beerus, having decided a world was worth watching, tended to indulge himself a little longer before moving on, and there remained, apparently, several more restaurants in Hosu he had not yet properly evaluated. It was 3 more days before the god of destruction and his angel attendant stood once more atop the rooftop where they'd first arrived, Whis's staff already tracing the faint, familiar shape of a rift back into the space between worlds, and the whole improbable chapter of Musutafu's history began, at last, to close. The rift opened slow this time, unhurried, none of the abrupt violence that had marked their arrival 3.5 weeks earlier, just a quiet scene in the air, patient, waiting for 2 beings who were, for once, in no particular rush to use it. Below the rooftop, Musutafu carried on in the gold light of late afternoon, unaware, as cities so often are, of exactly how much had been decided above its rooftops in the quiet hours nobody had witnessed. Somewhere in that skyline, Endeavor was training, still turning over a fight he hadn't won, and somehow hadn't lost either. Somewhere in a UA dormitory, a green-haired boy was filling the last pages of a notebook with theories he'd never publish, because some things, he'd decided, were worth understanding privately rather than proving to anyone. Somewhere in the city's quieter districts, a hero named Kamui Woods was walking his usual patrol, past a convenience store that had, without ever knowing why, been given a second chance at an ordinary Tuesday. And somewhere in the shadows the League still called home, a young man with decayed hands and red eyes sat with a conversation he hadn't finished having with himself, no closer to knowing what he was for, but, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely trying to find out. Nezu stood at the base of the rooftop stairs, having climbed them once more, unbidden, to see the 2 of them off properly. "You could stay longer," he offered. "There's still a great deal we haven't shown you." "There always will be," Beerus said. "That's rather the point of leaving before I get bored of finding out." "Some things are better left slightly unfinished, Nezu. It gives a world a reason to keep surprising you the next time you look." "Will there be a next time?" Beerus considered the question with more care than he'd given most things in the last 3 weeks, tail flicking once, thoughtfully. "Perhaps," he said. "I find myself, against my own better judgment, curious what this rock does with the chance I've given it. That's not nothing, Nezu. From me, that's practically a promise." Whis, already half through the rift, offered Nezu a final, warm smile. "Do keep an eye on the boy," he said. "The green-haired one. I have a feeling this world hasn't finished surprising either of us where he's concerned." Then they were gone, the rift closing behind them with the same quiet, unhurried ease it had opened, leaving nothing behind but a rooftop, an empty sky, and a world that had come astonishingly close to ending, and had, instead, simply been asked to keep becoming whatever it was going to be. Nezu stood alone for a long moment, watching the place where the sky had briefly, impossibly opened, and then turned back toward the stairs, toward the ordinary, unfinished business of a school, a city, a civilization that had just been handed something far rarer than survival. It had been handed a second chance to matter, and, this time, no one was watching to grade it.